My son looked me dead in the eye and called me a financial burden right before abandoning me at a rundown state-funded nursing home. He told me I was too much trouble to care for and drove off, leaving me standing in the dirt with nothing but a worn-out duffel bag. At that moment, I felt my whole world shatter. But I refused to let that be my fate. I did not let the humiliation defeat me. Instead, I took back my dignity and made a choice that would completely destroy his perfect little life. I was not the weak old man he thought I was, and I certainly was not done living yet. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respecting your elders is a line you never ever cross. My name is Nelson Wright. I am 69 years old, and until that chilly Tuesday morning, I truly thought I had raised a good, honorable man. The drive had been suspiciously quiet. Cameron kept his eyes glued to the road, tapping his fingers nervously against the leather steering wheel of his shiny new luxury SUV. He had told me we were going to Dr. Evans' clinic for a routine heart checkup, but as we veered off the main highway and headed into the industrial outskirts of town, a knot formed in my stomach. Suddenly, Cameron slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the cracked, uneven pavement. I looked out the passenger window expecting to see a medical plaza. Instead, my eyes met a rusted wrought iron gate with peeling paint that spelled out Shady Pines Assisted Living. The building behind it looked more like a neglected prison than a care facility. The lawn was mostly dead brown patches of dirt, and a heavy, depressing scent of bleach hung in the damp air. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from illness, but from the sudden freezing realization of what was happening. Cameron refused to look my way. The engine idled with a low, rumbling sound that felt like the ticking of a time bomb. I had been lured into a trap by my own flesh and blood. Before I could even process the magnitude of the betrayal, the back door swung open. My daughter-in-law Megan stepped out onto the dirt driveway. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat and a pair of designer boots that probably cost more than the monthly salary of the nurses working inside that miserable building. With a look of absolute disgust, she reached into the trunk, grabbed my faded canvas duffel bag, and tossed it carelessly onto the ground. The bag hit a muddy puddle, splashing dirty water onto the fabric. Megan did not even flinch. She simply smoothed out an invisible wrinkle on her expensive coat and looked at me with eyes as cold as ice. "Nelson, let us be completely honest here," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "We need the house. We need the space for our growing family, and maintaining you is a financial burden we can no longer carry. You are too much to take care of, and frankly, you do not fit into our lifestyle anymore. Shady Pines is fully state-funded, so you will be fine." I shifted my gaze to my son, hoping to find a shred of guilt. Cameron finally turned to me, his face pale, muttering hollow, pathetic apologies. "Mom would understand, Dad." He stammered, his voice weak and cowardly. "We just need our own space. It is nothing personal, it is just how things have to be now. You are getting older, and we cannot afford to look after you." The sheer audacity of his words felt like a physical blow. He sat there in a luxury car that he could barely afford, telling the man who had wiped his tears and paid for his college that I was too expensive to keep around. They were throwing me away like a piece of broken furniture, convinced I had outlived my usefulness. I slowly stepped out of the car and looked down at my scuffed, cheap suede shoes. They were ugly, worn out, and deliberately chosen. Looking at them, I could almost hear the sweet voice of my late wife, Camille, echoing in my mind. "Nelson," she had told me on her deathbed, holding my hand with her fragile fingers, "if you spoil that boy, you will create an ungrateful man. Let him stand on his own 2 feet. Make him work for his life." I had taken her dying wish to heart. For years after she passed, I lived a life of deliberate poverty. I drove a beat-up pickup truck, wore frayed flannel shirts, and lived on what appeared to be a meager fixed pension. I let Cameron believe I was just a retired blue-collar worker barely scraping by. What my greedy son and his arrogant wife did not know was that I was a retired chief engineer and a mastermind commercial contractor. Over 4 decades, I had built some of the most profitable commercial complexes in the state. I possessed a massive, hidden real estate empire and an $8 million trust fund. I hid my true identity to teach him independence, but my silence had only revealed the deep, rotten core of his character. I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not shed a single tear for the son I had just lost to greed. A man who builds skyscrapers knows that panicking during a structural failure only gets you killed. You have to assess the damage, isolate the weak points, and prepare the demolition. I bent down with a slow, deliberate calmness, my old joints popping slightly in the cold air, and picked up my muddy duffel bag. I looked Cameron dead in the eye one last time. There was no love left in my gaze, only the cold calculation of an engineer staring at a condemned building. I turned my back on them and walked toward the rusted iron gates of Shady Pines. As I pushed the heavy metal door open, my posture shifted. The hunched, frail old man act dissolved. My eyes, trained to spot structural flaws from 50 yards away, began to scan the facility. I noted the outdated magnetic locks on the front entrance. I spotted the blind spots in the cheap, dusty security cameras mounted on the brick walls. I saw the rusted hinges on the fire escape doors. I was walking into their prison, but my mind was already drafting the blueprints for my escape. I was not a helpless victim walking to his slaughter. I was a Trojan horse. I stepped into the dimly lit reception area, fully accepting the reality of the war they had just started. Just as the heavy glass doors began to close behind me, sealing me inside the dreary lobby of the facility, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I paused and looked over my shoulder through the smeared glass. Megan had rolled down the passenger window, the cold wind blowing her perfectly styled blonde hair. She leaned out, flashing me a triumphant, malicious smirk that twisted her features. "Enjoy your new home, Nelson," she called out, her voice loud enough to pierce through the glass. "And do not worry about your old house. I already found a cash buyer for it. We sign the papers tomorrow morning." The window rolled up, blocking out the sound, and the SUV sped off down the road, leaving a cloud of gray exhaust in its wake. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken everything from me, but they had no idea whose land they were standing on. I walked up to the heavily fortified reception desk. The sharp, overwhelming scent of industrial antiseptic and stale urine made my stomach turn instantly. I needed to pick up my daily blood pressure medication, a simple vital prescription I had reliably paid for out of pocket for the last decade. I reached into my faded jeans, pulled out my everyday credit card, and slid it under the scratched plexiglass window. The cashier, a tired-looking woman who barely bothered to make eye contact, snatched it up and swiped it through the dirty terminal. The machine let out a sharp, angry beep. She frowned, wiped the magnetic strip on her sweater, and swiped it a second time. The exact same harsh beep echoed through the quiet lobby. She tapped a long acrylic fingernail loudly against the glass, staring at me with a mixture of annoyance and heavy pity. "Sir, your card has been declined," she said flatly, projecting her voice loud enough for the other fragile residents loitering in the lobby to hear clearly. I stood frozen in place. Declined. That public checking account always held more than enough funds to cover my basic living expenses for the entire year. I asked her to run it one more time, assuring her there must be a system error, but the result was identical. The piece of plastic in my hand felt suddenly completely dead. The betrayal I was experiencing had not just been a physical abandonment in a parking lot. It was a calculated financial execution. Before I could demand the use of a phone to contact my bank, the facility manager stepped out from a cramped back office. He was a tall, imposing man with a cheap suit and a clipboard tucked tightly under his arm. "Mr. Wright," he announced, his tone devoid of any actual professional respect. "Your son Cameron finalized your admission paperwork early this morning. He specifically instructed us to cancel all your supplemental medical coverage, premium meal plans, and any extra physical therapy. He stated on the record that you are on a very strict fixed income and that basic state-funded care is all your family can possibly afford to provide." My chest tightened painfully. Basic care in a place like Shady Pines meant absolute minimum survival. It meant waiting hours for a glass of water. A burly orderly grabbed my arm with unnecessary aggressive force and escorted me down a flickering fluorescent hallway. The walls were painted a sickening shade of green and stained with years of grim neglect. He pushed open a heavy wooden door and pointed me inside without a word. The room was dark, windowless, and smelled distinctly of mildew and unwashed sheets. I was not getting a private space to rest. I was violently shoved into a cramped, damp room already occupied by 4 other frail men who were just staring blankly at the peeling ceiling tiles. The orderly tossed a faded, scratchy patient gown onto a rusted metal bed frame in the exact corner of the room. "Put this on right now," he ordered sharply. Personal clothing is considered a liability hazard in this wing. The sheer humiliation of stripping off my own clothes to wear a stained, paper-thin gown was designed to break a man. It was deliberately meant to strip away my personal identity to turn me into just another forgotten statistic, waiting quietly for the end of his life. Cameron and Megan wanted me thoroughly demoralized. They wanted me to feel utterly powerless, isolated, and entirely dependent on their non-existent mercy. I sat heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress, running my calloused hands over the rough, cheap fabric of the hospital gown. I closed my eyes and forced my mind to drift away from the suffocating stench of the small room. For 40 years, these exact hands had laid the massive steel foundations for the most lucrative commercial complexes in the entire state. I remembered the roaring noise of the busy construction sites, the metallic smell of fresh concrete, and the heavy weight of a hard hat on my head. I was the chief engineer who directed hundreds of skilled men and approved massive urban developments that reshaped city skylines. I had sat at the head of glass boardrooms surrounded by desperate investors writing out multi-million-dollar checks with a single, effortless stroke of my pen. I commanded sprawling empires of steel and glass. Yet here I was sitting in the miserable dark, shivering in a cheap cotton rag, denied a $20 blood pressure prescription by my own flesh and blood. The stark contrast between my reality and their perception of me was almost laughable. I had built towering fortresses designed to withstand brutal hurricanes and massive earthquakes, but I had somehow failed to see the toxic rot eating away at the foundation of my own family. But a master builder knows a crucial truth. A structure only collapses completely if you stop reinforcing it. I was not about to let my legacy crumble into dust because of a greedy boy and his arrogant wife. I waited patiently until the orderly completed his scheduled rounds and the hallway fell completely silent. I slipped out of the damp room, walking quietly in my socks along the scuffed linoleum floor. At the far end of the corridor, I had spotted a rusted payphone mounted unevenly on the wall. It looked like it had not been cleaned or serviced in a decade, but the dial tone hummed steadily when I lifted the heavy receiver. I punched in a sequence of numbers entirely from memory, bypassing the useless general customer service lines and dialing the direct desk of my branch bank manager, Richard. When he finally answered, I kept my voice low but undeniably commanding. "Richard, this is Nelson Wright," I said, cutting sharply through his polite corporate greeting. "I need an immediate status report on my public checking account right this second." There was a long, tense pause filled only with the rapid clicking of his keyboard. "Nelson," he finally replied, his voice thick with shock and confusion. "Your account was completely zeroed out 2 hours ago. Exactly $40,000 was withdrawn via a direct wire transfer." My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. "Who authorized this transaction?" I demanded, my tone icy. Richard cleared his throat nervously. "Your son Cameron did." "Cameron." He came in person right when the branch opened and presented a fully notarized power of attorney. He claimed your mental health had rapidly declined overnight and he needed to take immediate control of your finances to pay for your specialized full-time care. The sheer audacity of the lie burned like acid through my veins. Cameron had forged my signature on a complex legal document manipulating the banking system to drain my daily funds while I was simultaneously being driven to this hellhole. He had stolen my money under the deceptive guise of paying for the very medical care he had just explicitly canceled. I firmly instructed Richard to pull the copies of that fraudulent paperwork immediately and hold them for my lawyer. I was about to hang up the receiver and start formulating my strategic counterattack when Richard spoke again, his tone dropping to a frantic, nervous whisper. "Nelson, that is not the worst part of this mess," he stammered, his breath catching. While processing the cash withdrawal, Cameron also leveraged that exact same power of attorney with our corporate loan department. I felt a cold, sudden chill wash over my entire body. "What exactly did he do?" Richard, I asked, demanding the truth. "He did not just empty your cash, Nelson. He took out a massive high-interest predatory loan against your primary residence. Your home is now fully mortgaged to the maximum limit, and if the first exorbitant payment is not made by the end of this month, the bank will be legally forced to initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings against you." Before Richard could utter another panicked syllable, the heavy plastic receiver was violently ripped from my grip. The rusted coil cord snapped back, hitting the peeling green wall with a sharp crack. I spun around to find the facility manager standing inches from my face, his chest puffed out and his cheap suit reeking of stale cigarette smoke. His eyes were dark and predatory, a man who enjoyed the small amount of power he wielded over the helpless. He slammed the receiver back onto the hook, cutting off my only lifeline to the outside world. "You do not have phone privileges, Mr. Wright." He spat out the words with a condescending sneer. "Your son was extremely specific during his intake briefing. He warned us that your cognitive decline causes you to make harassing phone calls to banks and businesses. For your own safety and for the peace of mind of your loving family, you are strictly forbidden from contacting the outside world without Cameron giving us direct written authorization. You are completely cut off, old man." He gestured sharply to the burly orderly who had suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway. "Take him back to his room." The orderly marched me back down the flickering fluorescent corridor, his thick fingers digging painfully into my shoulder. He shoved me through the heavy wooden door of my assigned room, and the loud mechanical click of the external lock dropping into place echoed like a gunshot. I was officially a prisoner. I stood in the center of the cramped, damp space, and the suffocating reality of my situation closed in around me. Cameron and Megan had planned this execution with terrifying precision. By locking me in this miserable facility and branding me mentally incompetent, they had completely isolated me. They were buying themselves the unchecked time and silence needed to liquidate every visible asset I owned, to sell my house and drain my public accounts without any interference. I looked around the dismal room at the 4 other men sharing this cell. They were slumped in their rusted beds, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper or muttering quietly to themselves. Their eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any remaining spark of life or resistance. They had been broken by the system by the neglect and by the sheer exhaustion of being treated like discarded burdens. They simply accepted the daily abuse because they believed they had no other choice. They were ghosts waiting for the end. But I was not like them. I refused to fade away in a puddle of my own despair while my greedy son destroyed everything I had built. I paced the narrow space between the beds, my mind racing through architectural blueprints of legal strategy and structural defense. I needed to establish a secure line of communication, and I needed to do it immediately. I could not wait for the morning. I could not wait for shift changes. I had to find a weak point in Shady Pine's human infrastructure. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and reached under the frayed collar of my cheap flannel sweater. My fingers brushed against the cold, heavy metal of a vintage Rolex Submariner tightly strapped to my wrist. I had worn it securely hidden under thick, long sleeves for years. It was a flawless masterpiece of engineering, but much more importantly, it was the 20th anniversary gift from my beautiful Camille. She had quietly saved her own money for years to buy it for me, presenting it with a brilliant smile that could easily light up the darkest room. It was the only item of genuine monetary value I had kept on my person during this entire ordeal. Megan, with her absolute obsession for flashy brand names and shallow luxury, had actually seen the watch a dozen times, but her arrogant ignorance had successfully protected me. She took one single look at my scuffed work boots and my battered pickup truck and automatically assumed the classic timepiece was just a cheap street corner knockoff. Her blatant prejudice completely blinded her to true quality and wealth. That watch was currently worth more than $30,000 on the open market. It was a solid gold key capable of unlocking any door if I could just find the right person willing to turn the lock. I waited patiently until the evening meal call sounded through the broken intercom system when the orderlies were busy herding the docile residents toward the bleak cafeteria. The external lock on my door disengaged, and I slipped out into the chaotic hallway. I did not head toward the dining area with the others. Instead, I moved silently toward the rear administrative desk, keeping to the shadows. Sitting behind the chipped Formica counter was Tanya, a sharp-eyed African-American nurse I had observed closely earlier in the day. She had spent the entire afternoon aggressively rolling her eyes at the manager and muttering curses under her breath whenever he barked impossible demanding orders at the underpaid staff. She fundamentally hated this place and the corrupt people who ran it just as much as I did. That vocal dissatisfaction was the exact structural weakness I urgently needed to exploit. I stepped up to her desk, ensuring my back fully shielded our interaction from the hallway security camera. Tanya did not even look up from her disorganized clipboard. "Mealtime is in the cafeteria, sir," she said, sounding incredibly exhausted and drained. I did not speak a single word. I simply unclasped the heavy vintage Rolex from my wrist and placed it gently onto the direct center of her paperwork. The solid gold, gleaming brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights, demanded immediate attention. Tanya froze completely. Her dark eyes widened immensely as she took in the flawless craftsmanship, the sweeping second hand, and the undeniable heavy weight of genuine luxury resting casually on her cheap plastic clipboard. She finally looked up at me, her expression shifting rapidly from tired annoyance to absolute shock. "This is not a fake," I told her, my voice steady and deadly serious. "You can have it appraised anywhere in the city tomorrow morning, and it will easily buy you a permanent way out of this miserable dead-end job. It is yours to keep forever. I only want one single thing in exchange for it." I pushed a small scrap of paper with a 10-digit phone number across the desk toward her. "Dial this exact number from your personal cell phone right now and hand the device to me. No questions asked." Tanya looked slowly from the $30,000 watch back up to my deadpan, uncompromising face. She swallowed hard, her professional apprehension being instantly overpowered by the life-changing value sitting right in front of her. Without uttering a single word, she swiftly swept the heavy Rolex into her deep scrub pocket, pulled out her personal smartphone and dialed the requested number. The line rang twice before someone picked up. She handed the glowing phone to me, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. I pressed the device firmly to my ear and spoke immediately, cutting sharply through the silence. "Protocol Blackbird Delta 7. I commanded, reciting the highly classified emergency security code I had established many years ago. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line before a sharp, cold, and incredibly dangerous voice answered. "I have been waiting for this call for a long time, Mr. Wright." It was Bradley Reed, the most ruthless commercial attorney in the state and my personal legal shark. I gripped the phone tighter, pressing it hard against my ear to drown out the distant hum of the facility. Bradley did not waste time with pleasantries or false sympathy. "Nelson," he said, his voice sharp and urgent, "we have a massive problem on our hands. My legal team just intercepted a highly confidential court filing. Your son Cameron is not just draining your bank accounts and mortgaging your house. He has submitted an emergency petition to transfer you to a maximum security closed psychiatric ward at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. He is using that forged medical document to have you declared completely incompetent and an active danger to yourself and others. Once you are locked inside that closed ward, he will gain absolute, irreversible legal control over your entire estate. He will be able to liquidate every single asset you own without a judge ever batting an eye." My blood ran completely cold. A psychiatric ward. It was a definitive death sentence for my freedom and my dignity. They were going to lock me in a padded cell and pump me full of heavy sedatives until my mind actually did waste away. "I need to get out of here tonight, Bradley," I whispered firmly, my resolve hardening like concrete. "Do not intervene legally just yet. Wait for my signal." I handed the phone back to Tanya, gave her a single nod of profound gratitude, and walked swiftly away into the shadows of the corridor. I had barely slipped back into my cramped, miserable room when the heavy atmosphere of Shady Pines shifted from a neglected care facility to a maximum security prison. The loud, jarring sound of heavy deadbolts sliding into place echoed down the long linoleum hallway. I peeked through the small, scratched window of my door. Two massive security guards built like nightclub bouncers rather than medical professionals were actively patrolling the corridor. They moved with aggressive, heavy footsteps, violently rattling every single door handle to ensure they were securely locked from the outside. Cameron had clearly paid top dollar to the corrupt management to ensure his highly valuable prisoner did not miraculously wander off before the morning transfer. The facility manager walked right behind them, holding a massive metal ring of keys. "Lock the front entrance and secure all the rear fire escapes," he barked, his voice laced with cruel, arrogant authority. "The old man in room 12 is a massive flight risk. Do not take your eyes off this hallway for a single second." I stepped back into the dark shadows of the room as their heavy boots approached my door. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain completely silent. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside my room. A large shadow eclipsed the thin sliver of light under the doorframe. I could hear the guard breathing heavily just inches away from the cheap wood. The metal handle jiggled violently as he tested the lock. It held firm. Satisfied, the guard chuckled lowly to his partner. "He is not going anywhere," he muttered, and their heavy footsteps slowly moved away down the hall. I was officially trapped in a cage. If I stayed in this sagging bed until sunrise, Cameron would arrive with a noisy ambulance and men in white coats. They would ruthlessly strap me to a gurney, drug me into senseless oblivion, and steal 4 decades of my incredibly hard work. I had to break out immediately, and I had to do it using only the pathetic resources available in this miserable room. I knelt by the door and closely examined the electronic magnetic lock mechanism installed right above the handle. It was a cheap generic commercial model, probably installed a decade ago by the lowest desperate bidder. A faint, arrogant smile touched my lips in the darkness. Over my 40-year career as a chief engineer, I had personally reviewed and approved the complex security blueprints for dozens of high-rise banking centers and impenetrable corporate headquarters. I knew the exact complex wiring schematics of military-grade biometric entry systems. I understood the precise voltage required to trip a fail-safe relay or bypass a closed circuit board. Compared to the massive secure fortresses I had built from the ground up, this flimsy magnetic lock was nothing more than a child's plastic toy. Camille used to tease me affectionately about my obsessive, relentless attention to structural detail. She would say, "Nelson, you treat every building in the city like a puzzle waiting to be solved." She was absolutely right. I viewed the world in terms of circuits, load-bearing walls, and electrical currents. Cameron thought he had successfully locked a helpless, vulnerable old man in a room. He completely forgot that the man he recklessly imprisoned was a master contractor who knew exactly how to dismantle a building from the inside out. My mind quickly mapped out the internal wiring of the lock, separating the power source from the magnetic seal. I waited in absolute tense silence until the rusted wall clock in the hallway hit midnight. The facility had gone completely still, save for the occasional wet coughing from the other broken inmates sharing my room. I crept over to the small battered nightstand next to my bed. Sitting on top of it was a broken battery-operated radio belonging to one of my sleeping roommates. Moving with practiced surgical precision, I snapped off the thin metal antenna and pulled out a small coil of copper wire from the exposed back casing. I then fished a sturdy metal paperclip out of my jeans pocket. It was all the arsenal I needed to execute my escape. I approached the heavy door and carefully popped off the cheap plastic casing of the electronic lock using the sharp edge of the paperclip. A tangled mess of red and black wires stared back at me in the dim light. I swiftly identified the primary power relay. Twisting the copper wire tightly around the paperclip, I created a makeshift bypass jumper. I held my breath, pressed the improvised metallic tool against the exposed electrical terminals, and sent a tiny surge of residual current directly into the locking mechanism. A soft mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet room. The bright green light on the security panel flickered once and died completely. The heavy magnetic seal released instantly. I pushed the heavy door open, slipping into the dark hallway like a ghost. I navigated the bleak corridors with extreme caution, avoiding the direct line of sight of the cheap, dusty security cameras, until I reached the rear fire exit. I repeated the exact same bypass procedure on the emergency door, overriding the blaring alarm trigger with another precise surge of electricity. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out into the freezing, biting rain. The icy cold water soaked through my clothes immediately, but I did not care at all. I was finally out of their cage. I pulled my soaked collar tightly around my shivering shoulders and began the grueling 5-mile trek down the pitch-black highway toward my own home. The storm raged violently around me, the icy wind cutting straight to my aching bones. Every single step was a brutal battle against the severe elements in my own aging body, but the burning, furious desire for justice fueled my relentless momentum. I kept to the muddy shoulder of the road, staying completely out of sight of any passing trucks. I had walked for nearly 2 hours when a sudden piercing light broke through the heavy curtain of freezing rain. Ahead of me, the blinding red and blue flashing lights of a police cruiser tore through the impenetrable darkness. The siren wailed aggressively, echoing sharply against the wet, slick asphalt. The vehicle accelerated rapidly, violently swerving across the empty lanes and heading directly toward my position. I threw myself violently into the thick, thorny bushes lining the highway, feeling the sharp, wet branches tear ruthlessly at my soaked clothes. The police cruiser roared past, its blinding red and blue lights slicing sharply through the heavy rain, but the officers never even slowed down. They were likely responding to a completely unrelated emergency, or perhaps the corrupt manager at Shady Pines had not yet realized his highly prized prisoner was gone. I lay completely flat in the freezing mud, holding my breath until the wailing siren faded into the distant darkness. Pulling myself up, I forced my aching legs to keep moving through the brutal storm. Every single step was a harsh battle against physical exhaustion and the freezing cold, but the burning fire of betrayal kept my momentum steady. After what felt like an absolute eternity, the familiar silhouette of my own neighborhood finally appeared through the heavy downpour. I crept down the familiar quiet street, staying completely hidden in the deep shadows of the large oak trees until I stood directly outside my own property boundary. The house looked exactly as I had left it just hours ago, but it no longer felt like a peaceful sanctuary. It felt like a hostile war zone. I moved stealthily toward the glowing living room window, keeping my head extremely low to avoid casting any visible shadow across the lawn. Peering carefully through the rain-slicked glass, my blood instantly boiled in my veins. There, sitting comfortably on the very sofa my late wife had carefully picked out, were Cameron and Megan. The fireplace was roaring, casting a warm golden light over their smug, incredibly relaxed faces. On the coffee table sat a bottle of my most prized vintage Bordeaux, a rare, expensive wine I had specifically saved for a momentous family occasion. Megan held a crystal glass, swirling the dark red liquid with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. "Can you believe how incredibly easy that was?" She laughed, her voice carrying clearly through the slightly cracked window pane. "I honestly thought the old man would put up way more of a fight, but he just marched right into that filthy dump like a good little obedient soldier." Cameron chuckled, leaning back heavily and taking a long, arrogant sip from his own glass. "He is completely clueless, Megan. He actually believes we care about him getting professional medical help. The real help is the massive cash payout we get tomorrow when the real estate agent finalizes the quick cash sale of this rundown property." Megan kicked her designer boots up onto my antique wooden coffee table, scratching the finish. "Thank God," she sneered, her tone laced with pure greed. "My luxury boutique is literally bleeding cash right now, Cameron. The high-end suppliers were threatening to cut me off completely by the end of the week. That massive cash injection from selling this pathetic little house is going to completely save my entire business. I will finally be able to expand the showroom and rebrand my image." She clinked her glass against his. To new beginnings, she cheered loudly, and to finally losing the dead weight. Hearing her refer to my life, my home, and my very existence as dead weight while drinking my private wine in my own living room was the absolute ultimate insult. They were celebrating my supposed demise while I was standing freezing in the mud right outside their window. I stepped back from the window, letting the icy rain wash over my face to cool the burning, raging fire inside my chest. This house deliberately looked modest and unassuming from the outside. With its weathered siding and overgrown front garden, it perfectly played the part of a struggling blue-collar retiree's simple home. But like all my highly successful architectural projects, the true strength was hidden deep within the foundation. Camille and I had designed it that exact way on purpose. She was the most brilliant, intuitive woman I ever knew, possessing a razor-sharp intuition for reading people's true intentions. "Nelson," she used to tell me late at night as we balanced our financial ledgers, "never ever display the full extent of your wealth. Flashy money always attracts desperate parasites. You must always maintain a secure failsafe, a hidden plan B, to protect our family legacy from those who seek to harvest what they did not sow." She had seen the greedy, calculating look in Megan's eyes the very first day Cameron brought her home. Camille knew instantly that Megan was a dangerous gold digger and warned me to secure the perimeter of our hard-earned assets. I had followed my beautiful wife's brilliant advice to the exact letter, ensuring the true massive scope of my financial empire remained completely buried underneath the humble facade of this quiet suburban house. I silently moved around to the back of the house, navigating the familiar yard in the pitch-black darkness with absolute precision. I reached deep under a heavy terracotta planter near the back door and retrieved the rusted spare key I had kept hidden there for over a decade. I slid the key into the heavy deadbolt, turning it with agonizing slowness to prevent the internal tumblers from making any loud metallic clicking sounds that might alert the thieves upstairs. Pushing the heavy door open, I slipped directly into the narrow stairwell leading down to the basement. The air down here was thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth, exactly as I remembered. I moved quietly past my abandoned tool benches until I reached the far, dark corner of the underground room. I dropped to my knees and ran my calloused fingers over the familiar dusty oak floorboards. Finding the tiny hidden notch I had carved years ago, I used a flathead screwdriver from a nearby workbench to pry up the loose, heavy wooden plank. Beneath the wooden floor, nestled safely inside a custom-built concrete recess, sat a heavy, reinforced, fireproof steel lockbox. I quickly spun the mechanical combination dial and popped the heavy latches open. I lifted the heavy lid and verified the contents were completely untouched. Inside, resting safely in waterproof folders, were the certified ownership deeds to half a dozen of the most lucrative commercial properties in the downtown financial district. Right beneath those lay the certified legal documentation for a massive, untouchable $8 million private trust fund fully legally registered under my own name. I was a completely self-made stealth tycoon, and this lockbox was the absolute undisputed proof of my immense power. I carefully extracted the heavy waterproof folders containing my financial weaponry, securing them tightly inside the inner waterproof pocket of my wet jacket. I was officially armed for absolute war. I carefully closed the heavy lid of the steel lockbox and secured the mechanical latches, shutting it tightly. I was just about to slide the thick oak floorboard back into its hidden place when the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs suddenly swung open with a loud, piercing creak. A sharp beam of yellow light flooded the narrow stairwell, cutting violently through the basement darkness. The distinct sound of heavy footsteps began descending the creaking wooden stairs, moving aggressively and with clear, determined purpose. It was Cameron. He was coming straight down into the basement, likely to search for any hidden valuables or old antiques he could pawn off before the morning house sale. I froze completely in the darkness, clutching the waterproof folders tightly against my chest. There was absolutely no alternate exit from this underground room, and his heavy footsteps were getting closer with every passing second. I flattened myself entirely against the damp concrete wall, sliding desperately behind a towering stack of dusty cardboard boxes just as the harsh yellow light bulb flickered to life. My heart hammered against my ribs with enough force to crack them. I held my breath, clutching the heavy waterproof folders tightly to my chest. Cameron reached the bottom of the wooden stairs, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He did not even bother to look toward the dark corner where I was hiding. His bleary eyes were focused entirely on the dusty wooden wine rack built into the opposite wall. He grabbed another expensive vintage bottle of my private collection, tucked it under his arm, and turned right back around. He marched up the stairs, muttering to himself about needing a corkscrew. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, plunging the basement back into absolute darkness. I let out a long, silent exhale. Moving with the practiced stealth of a man half my age, I slid the oak floorboard back into its original position. I slipped quietly out the back door, locking the deadbolt behind me, and vanished into the freezing rain, clutching the documents that would destroy their world. The very next morning, while I was safely securing my future, the true depth of their greed was on full display. My private investigator, who had been monitoring their communications, sent me a crystal-clear audio intercept of Megan's phone call. She was pacing furiously in my kitchen, screaming into her cell phone at a local real estate agent. "Listen to me very carefully," Megan shrieked, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "I do not care about the standard 30-day closing procedures. We need this house sold, and the cash wired into our account by the end of the week. Do whatever it takes to push the paperwork through immediately." The agent on the other end tried to explain the legal requirements for property transfers, but Megan rudely cut him off. "You are not listening to me," she snarled, pacing back and forth across my hardwood floors. "I am willing to drop the asking price by another 20% if the buyer pays straight cash today. My luxury boutique is facing a massive vendor audit, and if I do not inject capital into my business accounts by Friday, the suppliers are going to completely seize my seasonal inventory. Do your job and get me my money." She ended the call with a vicious swipe at her phone screen. She was completely frantic, utterly desperate to liquidate my lifelong sanctuary just to salvage her failing vain attempt at being a high society fashion icon. She and Cameron had forcefully locked me away in a living nightmare simply to use my home as a quick cash machine to fund their disastrous financial mistakes. They believed they were brilliant strategists, executing a flawless extraction of my wealth without any consequences. Their complete lack of empathy and basic human decency only fueled the cold fire burning inside my chest. I sat comfortably in the plush leather chair of Bradley Reed's sprawling downtown law office, listening to the recorded intercept. The panoramic windows behind his massive mahogany desk overlooked the bustling commercial district I had helped build from the ground up. Bradley handed me a thick, glossy folder detailing the exact financial history of Megan's supposedly successful luxury boutique. I slowly opened the file, examining the commercial lease agreements. When Megan originally scouted the location for her high-end fashion store 5 years ago, she insisted on renting the most expensive prime real estate in the city center. She constantly bragged at family dinners about securing a highly coveted storefront from a massive anonymous investment group, rubbing her fabricated success in my face while making snide remarks about my dirty work boots. What she never bothered to investigate, and what Cameron was far too ignorant to realize, was the actual identity of the corporate landlord holding her commercial lease. The anonymous investment group was a subsidiary entity entirely controlled by my primary trust. For 5 long years, Megan had been strutting around her designer showroom, looking down her nose at me, completely unaware that she was standing squarely on her father-in-law's property. She had built her entire arrogant persona on a foundation that I personally owned and maintained. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished desk, his eyes gleaming with the predatory anticipation of a lawyer about to secure a massive victory. "We can call the police right now, Nelson," he stated firmly. "We have undeniable proof of elder abuse, document forgery, and grand larceny. Cameron will be arrested before lunchtime." I looked down at the documents, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "No," I replied, my voice cold and calculated. "Handing them over to the police right now is far too easy. If they go to jail today, they will just play the victims. I want them to feel the exact same suffocating panic they forced upon me. I want their entire financial world to shatter while they are wide awake to witness it." I pulled a sleek gold pen from my inner jacket pocket and began signing the stack of legal directives Bradley had prepared. I systematically invalidated the forged power of attorney Cameron had submitted to the bank, revoking his access to every single account under my name. Then I moved to the most devastating document of all. I signed a formal corporate order immediately freezing the massive commercial credit guarantee fund that had been secretly backing Megan's entire business operation. Without my hidden financial safety net propping up her terrible credit score, her boutique would instantly trigger default clauses with every single one of her luxury suppliers. I was effectively pulling the structural foundation right out from under her feet, ensuring her business would collapse under the weight of its own debt. I reviewed the final page, checking every detail with an engineer's precision before handing the stack back to my lawyer. I made sure that every single loophole was securely closed tightly, sealing the financial trap around them. They had tried to strip me of my resources, but I was about to show them what true power looked like. Bradley watched me sign the final page with a slow, razor-sharp smile spreading across his face. He carefully gathered the signed documents and handed them directly to his senior paralegal standing silently by the door. "Execute these immediately," Bradley ordered without breaking eye contact with me. "Ensure the banking executives receive these directly." He turned back to his desk and closed the thick leather folder with a loud, definitive snap that echoed in the spacious office like a gavel falling in a courtroom. "The trap is officially set. Mr. Wright," he announced, his tone brimming with dark, absolute satisfaction. "The banks and the commercial vendors have received the emergency notices. The complete financial freeze will take effect across the entire banking system exactly at 12:00 noon today. They are about to lose absolutely everything they hold dear." Exactly as the heavy brass clock in the downtown square struck noon, the financial guillotine dropped. Miles away from the sterile prison they had forcefully locked me in, Cameron and Megan were currently celebrating their newly stolen wealth. They sat at a prime window table inside Le Grand Palais, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive French restaurant in the entire city. It was an establishment where a single appetizer cost more than what my hard-working parents used to make in an entire month. Through the high-definition live video feed provided by my private investigator, who was seated discreetly just 2 tables away, I watched their sickening display of absolute arrogance unfold in real time. Megan was practically shouting her order across the quiet, elegant dining room, demanding shaved black truffles over her imported steak and insisting on their most expensive bottle of vintage champagne. Cameron leaned back in his plush velvet chair, laughing loudly and playing the part of a high-rolling tycoon without a care in the world. They were toasting to their brilliant success, utterly convinced that they had just successfully executed the perfect financial heist. They clinked their crystal glasses together, celebrating my demise. They had absolutely no idea that the exact moment the clock hit 12, their entire artificial world had ceased to exist. Megan snapped her fingers aggressively in the air, signaling the young African-American waiter to approach their table. The young man, who looked to be working his way through college, hurried over with a polite professional smile. Megan did not even bother to look him in the eye, treating him like a piece of the furniture. "This champagne is completely unacceptable," she spat, her voice dripping with extreme condescension and unmasked prejudice. It tastes like it has been sitting in a hot warehouse for a decade. Take this back and bring me a fresh bottle right now, and do not walk so slowly this time. Time is money, something people in your position clearly do not understand. The young waiter maintained his composure, nodded respectfully, and took the expensive bottle away without uttering a single word of complaint. Cameron smirked, swirling the remaining golden liquid in his crystal flute. "You have to be firm with the working-class babe," he said loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "If you do not remind them of their place, they get lazy." Megan reached across the pristine white tablecloth and grabbed my son's hand, her diamond rings catching the bright chandelier light. "We do not ever have to worry about people like that again." "Cameron," she practically purred, her eyes wide with greedy ambition. "We are officially part of the upper echelon now. By the end of this week, that disgusting old man will be permanently rotting away in that state-funded dump, and his house will be entirely liquid cash in our accounts. No more pretending to care about his pathetic blue-collar stories. No more smelling his cheap soap. We finally got rid of the dead weight, and now we can live the life we actually deserve." Hearing those vicious words flowing so easily from her mouth confirmed every dark suspicion Camille and I ever had about her character. I was not just watching this pathetic spectacle on a small screen anymore. I was sitting comfortably in the plush leather back seat of a blacked-out luxury town car parked directly across the street from the restaurant. The dark-tinted windows shielded me completely from the outside world, allowing me to observe my son and his toxic wife with absolute clarity through the large glass storefront. Seeing Cameron sitting there openly mocking the working class sent a sharp, painful wave of disgust through my chest. I vividly remembered my own youth growing up in a cramped, unheated apartment where my parents scrubbed floors and hauled heavy bricks just to keep food on our small table. I had started my career carrying 50-pound bags of cement on my bare shoulders, working double shifts in the blistering summer heat to pay for my engineering degree. I had intentionally raised Cameron with stories of that struggle, hoping to instill in him the same ironclad work ethic and profound respect for honest labor. Instead, he had chosen to worship the shallow, flashy lifestyle that Megan represented. He had completely abandoned his roots, his morals, and his own father just to buy a seat at a table he did not earn. Looking at his arrogant face, my last remaining shred of paternal hesitation vanished entirely. My determination hardened into unbreakable steel. I would not surrender a single penny of my legacy to these ruthless parasites. The time for their absolute reckoning had officially arrived. Inside the restaurant, the polite young waiter returned, carrying a sleek black leather check presenter, holding the astronomical bill for their lavish celebration. He placed it gently on the table next to an electronic wireless card reader. Cameron barely glanced at the exorbitant total. He confidently pulled out his shiny platinum credit card, a card completely tied to my hijacked personal accounts, and dropped it onto the small tray with a theatrical flourish. The waiter inserted the chip into the machine. A harsh red light flashed immediately, accompanied by a loud, sharp beep. Declined. Cameron frowned, snatching the machine and staring at the glowing screen in total confusion. "Try it again," he ordered, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant swagger. The waiter complied, but the result was identical. Declined. Megan rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of extreme annoyance. "Give me that," she snapped, pulling her own designer wallet from her expensive handbag. She aggressively shoved her primary business credit card into the reader, expecting an instant approval. The machine beeped again. Declined. A flash of genuine panic crossed her heavily contoured face. She frantically pulled out a second card, then a third, shoving them into the slot with increasing desperation. Declined. 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 Every single financial lifeline they possessed had been systematically severed. The sudden loud commotion attracted the attention of the restaurant manager, a stern-looking man in an immaculate suit who approached their table with a hardened expression. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone perfectly polite but utterly unyielding. "There is a problem with your broken machines," Megan shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the now completely silent dining room. "Run these cards manually right now. Do you know who we are?" The manager crossed his arms firmly over his chest. "I am afraid all your financial institutions have flagged these accounts for severe fraud, ma'am," he stated clearly. "I must request that you settle this bill with cash immediately, or I will be forced to contact the police." Megan exploded into a fit of absolute rage, knocking over her crystal water glass and screaming that she was going to sue the entire establishment for public defamation. Two large security guards swiftly approached the table, placing their heavy hands firmly on Cameron's shoulders and forcing him to stand up. Megan continued to scream wildly, flailing her arms and hurling insults as the guards began physically escorting them both toward the front exit in front of dozens of shocked, staring patrons. The ultimate humiliation was unfolding in spectacular fashion for everyone to see. Right as they were being forcefully shoved through the heavy glass doors into the cold street, Cameron's cell phone began ringing frantically in his pocket. He struggled against the security guard's tight grip, managing to answer the call with a trembling hand. It was the corrupt director of Shady Pines. Cameron, the director, yelled, his voice panicked and completely out of breath. "We have a massive emergency on our hands. Your father is gone. He bypassed the electronic security locks and vanished into the storm last night without leaving a single trace behind." Cameron slowly lowered his cell phone from his ear, his face draining of all color until he looked entirely ghost white. He stood absolutely frozen on the busy sidewalk just outside the heavy glass doors of the exclusive French restaurant that had just forcefully ejected them. Megan clutched her useless designer handbag, staring at him with wild, frantic eyes. Her heavy makeup was slightly smudged from her humiliating public tantrum, and her breathing was ragged. "What is it?" she hissed, grabbing his arm aggressively and digging her manicured nails into his expensive jacket. "Why are your cards suddenly declining, and who the hell was on the phone?" Cameron swallowed hard, his voice barely a terrified whisper that was almost lost in the noise of the passing city traffic. "The nursing home manager just called me. My father is gone, Megan. He broke out of the facility last night and no one knows where he is." Megan stumbled back a step, her jaw dropping in sheer horror as the gravity of the situation hit her. The realization hit them both simultaneously like a physical blow to the stomach. Their carefully constructed plan to seize my entire estate was suddenly completely collapsing right in front of them. Without my signature or my physical presence to manipulate their fast-track cash sale of my home was completely dead in the water. They were stranded on the street with completely frozen bank accounts, zero cash to their name, and their absolute golden goose had vanished without a single trace. Megan did not waste a single second wallowing in defeat or questioning how an old man bypassed maximum security locks. Her innate greed instantly shifted into a vicious, desperate survival instinct. She aggressively yanked Cameron by the lapels of his jacket, forcing him to look her directly in the eyes. "We are not losing everything because of that stubborn old fool," she spat, her voice vibrating with pure malice and panic. "Call the police right this exact second. Tell them he has severe late-stage dementia and that he is missing." Cameron looked hesitant, terrified of escalating their lies to official law enforcement, but Megan ruthlessly tightened her grip, shaking him violently. "Tell them he is completely delusional, highly aggressive, and an active physical danger to the public," she commanded. "If he is wandering the streets out of his mind, the police will hunt him down for us. We just need him officially detained by the authorities so we can regain legal control." Cameron finally nodded, pulling his phone back out with trembling fingers. He dialed emergency services and immediately launched into a spectacular theatrical performance. He pitched his voice to sound perfectly heartbroken and panicked. "Please, you have to help me," he begged the dispatcher, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "My elderly father is suffering from aggressive dementia, and he just wandered away from his secure care facility. He is completely disconnected from reality, and he has severe violent tendencies when he gets confused. I am terrified he might hurt an innocent bystander or himself. We need officers to find him immediately." Sitting safely in the back of my tinted town car across the street, I listened to this entire repulsive exchange through the audio intercept provided by my investigator. They were maliciously weaponizing the police force against me, using my own hard-earned tax dollars to fund a manhunt. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human rights and drag me back in handcuffs just so they could fund their miserable, luxurious lifestyle. As the black town car smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging into the busy city traffic, my private investigator handed me a fresh intelligence report detailing their next moves. I looked down at the tablet screen, watching a live text transcript of Cameron's desperate police call, and a bitter, heavy sadness washed over me. I vividly remembered Cameron as a 7-year-old boy standing in our small kitchen after he had deliberately shattered Camille's favorite antique vase. Instead of crying or apologizing, he had immediately pointed his tiny finger at the neighbor's dog, spinning a wild, complex lie, just to avoid facing the consequences of his own reckless actions. Camille had warned me then that his persistent refusal to accept responsibility was an incredibly dangerous character trait. "Nelson," she had whispered later that night, her eyes filled with maternal worry. A boy who learns he can comfortably lie his way out of a broken vase will eventually lie his way out of anything. He will step on anyone to save himself. I had brushed it off as childish fear, believing he would simply outgrow it, but she had clearly seen the deeply rooted cowardice I flatly refused to acknowledge. Decades had passed, but that cowardly little boy had not changed at all. His refusal to take accountability had simply mutated into something far more sinister and destructive. He was no longer just lying to avoid a scolding from his mother. He was utilizing the criminal justice system to forcefully imprison his own father without a shred of guilt. But Megan and Cameron knew that simply having the police find me would not be nearly enough to secure their ultimate financial heist. If the authorities brought me back to a local hospital, any competent medical professional would instantly see that my mind was perfectly sharp and absolutely lucid. The doctors would ask questions, and my son's entire web of lies would instantly unravel. They needed bulletproof medical documentation to override my basic human rights before I could ever speak to a judge. Through the continuous surveillance feed, I watched as Cameron frantically made another phone call, this time to a highly unethical contact Megan had previously procured. It was Dr. Aris, a disgraced private physician notorious in the city's corrupt underbelly for writing fraudulent medical prescriptions and falsifying insurance claims for the right price. Cameron did not even attempt to negotiate or hide his criminal intentions. He immediately wired $10,000 from a secret hidden offshore account Megan had completely drained from her boutiques, remaining operational funds just moments before the total freeze took effect. In exchange for this massive bribe, Dr. Aris completely bypassed all ethical and legal protocols. He digitally signed and expedited a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, officially diagnosing me with severe irreversible Alzheimer's disease accompanied by dangerous psychotic episodes. He completely fabricated a medical history claiming he had personally treated my aggressive outbursts for the past 2 years and that I required immediate institutionalization. With this fraudulent document officially logged into the medical database, Cameron swiftly filed an emergency petition at the county courthouse demanding permanent emergency guardianship over my entire life and estate. They were constructing an inescapable legal cage designed to strip me of every single legal protection I possessed, leaving me completely at their non-existent mercy while they liquidated my life's work. They were essentially signing my mental death warrant to guarantee their own financial survival. It was a cold, calculated assassination of my character, and they were executing it with terrifying efficiency. I sat quietly in the plush leather seat of my moving vehicle, watching the dark city skyline roll by as their vicious trap rapidly expanded across the state. The fraudulent medical report worked exactly as they had maliciously planned, accelerating the police response to an unprecedented level. Within 2 hours, the local police department upgraded my case from a simple missing persons report to a critical, high-priority public safety threat. Suddenly, my secure smartphone buzzed aggressively as a blaring emergency alert bypassed my silent settings, vibrating against the leather seat. I looked down at the glowing screen with a hardened expression. It was an official, statewide silver alert. My personal photograph, taken from an old family album, was suddenly flashing across every single digital highway billboard and broadcasting on every evening news channel in the entire state. I was now an officially hunted man, globally labeled as a dangerous lunatic by the very society I had spent 40 years building. I sat comfortably at the polished mahogany dining table of the presidential suite in the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. A flawless medium-rare steak rested on the fine porcelain plate in front of me, but my appetite completely vanished as I looked up at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. There, glowing brightly in high definition, was my own face. The local news anchor wore a deeply somber expression as she reported breaking details on the statewide silver alert. The police department had just issued an urgent bulletin describing me as a severely confused, wandering, and potentially aggressive elderly man suffering from advanced stages of dementia. The news ticker scrolling endlessly at the bottom of the screen warned the public not to approach me directly, but to contact the authorities immediately. They painted a pathetic, heartbreaking picture of a frail, lost soul stumbling through the freezing rain, completely detached from reality. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, feeling a cold, sharp smile touch my lips. I was not shivering in an alleyway or hiding from the flashing police sirens. I was sitting in a 5-star suite, orchestrating their absolute ruin. The news broadcast suddenly cut to a live press conference held right on the damp front steps of my own house. Cameron stood directly in front of the flashing cameras, looking perfectly disheveled and utterly devastated. He had strategically unbuttoned his collar and mussed his hair to sell the image of an exhausted, terrified son who'd been searching endlessly for his sick father. Megan stood closely by his side, clutching his arm and wiping away invisible tears with a designer tissue. "Please," Cameron begged, his voice cracking with an incredibly convincing display of raw emotion. "If anyone out there sees my dad, please call the authorities immediately. He is very sick. He does not know where he is or what he is doing. He needs his daily medication, and we are absolutely terrified that the cold weather will be fatal for a man in his fragile condition. We just want our father back home safe where we can properly care for him." The sheer hypocrisy radiating from the television screen was physically repulsive. The reporters murmured in deep sympathy, visibly moved by the heart-wrenching performance of a desperate son fighting to save his deteriorating father. The local news anchors praised their dedication, completely unaware that the grieving family on their screen had forcefully locked me in a miserable state-funded prison just 48 hours prior to this theatrical display. Cameron was expertly manipulating the media, weaponizing public empathy to recruit thousands of innocent citizens into his malicious manhunt. He was using the massive power of the local news networks to cement the false narrative of my mental incompetence, ensuring that the moment I was found, my fate would be instantly sealed by the court of public opinion. He wanted the world to see a broken man so that nobody would ever question the chains he was preparing to put on me. Sitting in the quiet luxury of the presidential suite, I watched Cameron play the tragic victim, and I felt a profound sense of tactical familiarity. I knew the immense crushing power of media manipulation better than anyone. 2 decades ago, during the aggressive expansion of my commercial construction empire, a vicious rival contractor had attempted a hostile takeover of a massive city development project. They launched a brutal smear campaign attempting to paint my firm as structurally negligent and financially unstable. Instead of hiding behind closed doors or issuing panicked defensive statements, I had completely flipped the narrative. I invited the toughest investigative journalists directly onto my active construction sites, giving them total unrestricted access to my safety protocols and financial ledgers. I used the glaring spotlight of the media to thoroughly humiliate my competitors and expose their own deep-rooted corruption. Public opinion is an incredibly dangerous weapon, but it is entirely double-edged. It will completely destroy whoever is standing on the wrong side of the absolute truth when the blinding lights finally turn on. Cameron thought he was a brilliant strategist for utilizing the news cameras, but he was merely playing a childish game of checkers while I was setting up the board for a grandmaster checkmate. I did not cower in the hotel suite, waiting for the authorities to violently kick down my door. I stood up, straightened the collar of my impeccably tailored suit, and walked purposefully out of the grand lobby. I signaled for a private taxi and gave the driver a very specific destination. We were not driving to an airport to flee the state or a dark safe house to lay low. I instructed him to drive me directly to the State Independent Medical Board, the most rigorous, prestigious, and highly guarded psychiatric evaluation center in the entire region. This facility was entirely uncompromised, employing top-tier medical professionals who frequently testified as expert witnesses in high-profile federal court cases. They could not be bought or intimidated by cheap fraudsters. During the quiet ride across town, I pulled out my secure smartphone and made a direct call to the local police precinct, completely bypassing the frantic emergency lines. I calmly identified myself as the subject of the active silver alert. Before the shocked dispatcher could frantically send a fleet of patrol cars to violently detain me, I firmly stated my exact current location and my explicit intentions. I formally requested that 2 senior police officers be immediately dispatched to the medical board, not to arrest me, but to serve as official impartial witnesses to a comprehensive voluntary psychiatric evaluation. I explained that I was the victim of a fraudulent guardianship petition and required sworn law enforcement presence to document my absolute cognitive clarity. I was seizing absolute control of their malicious narrative. I would not be dragged into a corrupt hospital by force or ambushed by crooked doctors. I was walking through the front doors of the highest medical authority in the region entirely on my own terms, armed with irrefutable proof of my absolute sanity and ready to expose the criminals hunting me. The taxi pulled up smoothly to the pristine glass entrance of the medical center. I paid the driver, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and walked confidently through the sliding electronic doors. The brightly lit waiting room was filled with quiet patients and busy nurses moving efficiently behind the sleek marble reception desk. As I confidently strode toward the main counter, a man in a crisp white medical coat suddenly turned the corner holding a thick stack of clipboards. We nearly collided in the center of the lobby. He stumbled back, dropping a pen, and looked up at me with sudden, intense shock. It was Dr. Aris, the deeply corrupt and heavily bribed physician Megan had secretly paid to falsify my mental health records. He had intentionally positioned himself here to intercept me. Dr. Aris widened his eyes, feigning absolute shock before immediately lunging forward to aggressively block my path. "Nelson Wright," he shouted, his voice echoing obnoxiously across the pristine marble lobby. "Thank God we finally found you." He grabbed my upper arm with a bruising grip, deliberately trying to pull me off balance and make me stumble. "Please stay calm, Nelson. You are safe now. I know you are terribly confused and frightened." His highly theatrical performance was incredibly loud, instantly drawing the sharp attention of every single nurse, patient, and security guard in the vicinity. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted two freelance reporters who had likely been staking out the medical center due to the massive statewide silver alert. They were already raising their smartphones, recording the entire interaction. Dr. Aris was intentionally creating a highly volatile public spectacle, desperately hoping I would snap violently under the pressure. He wanted me to yell, struggle, or aggressively shove him away so the flashing cameras could capture the exact image of the aggressive, unhinged dementia patient Cameron had maliciously described on national television. I simply stood perfectly still, letting his hand grip my suit jacket, refusing to give him a single ounce of the chaotic reaction he was desperately fishing for. The heavy automatic glass doors slid open behind us, and two uniformed police officers stepped into the crowded lobby. They were the impartial law enforcement witnesses I had specifically requested during my taxi ride. Seeing the shiny silver badges approach, Dr. Aris immediately escalated his malicious performance, turning up the volume on his fake distress. "Officers, please assist me right away," he pleaded, waving them over with frantic theatrical urgency. "I am Dr. Aris, his primary care physician. This man is suffering from acute neurodegenerative psychosis and severe Alzheimer's-induced delirium. He is in the middle of a highly dangerous paranoid episode and poses an immediate active threat to himself and the general public." He then tightened his grip on my forearm, leaning in incredibly close to whisper a vicious threat directly into my ear where no one else could hear. "If you do not walk quietly with me to a private room right now, old man, I am calling a psychiatric ambulance to strap you to a gurney and pump you full of heavy sedatives until you forget your own name." The officers approached cautiously, their hands resting near their utility belts, assessing the tense standoff. Dr. Aris turned back to them, spouting a rapid-fire stream of complex fabricated medical jargon designed to confuse and intimidate them. His prefrontal cortex is severely compromised, leading to erratic hostile fugue states, he explained smoothly, projecting the absolute, unwavering authority of a seasoned medical professional. "I need to escort him to a secure closed ward immediately before he turns violent." He was expertly weaving a dense web of scientific lies, utilizing his white coat as an impenetrable shield of unquestionable truth, expecting the police to simply fall in line and assist in my illegal kidnapping. I did not flinch a single muscle. I did not raise my voice, drop my posture, or attempt to physically break his aggressive hold on my arm. During my 40 years working as a chief engineer, I had faced down some of the most ruthless, cutthroat corporate developers in the entire country. I had sat across long mahogany boardroom tables from hostile men who used every dirty intimidation tactic in the book to force me into signing terrible multi-million-dollar contracts. I had learned a very long time ago that in any high-stakes negotiation, the person who feels the desperate burning need to talk the loudest and fill the quiet space is almost always the one holding the weakest hand. Silence is a devastating weapon, and maintaining absolute composure under extreme pressure is exactly how you force an arrogant opponent to expose their own fatal structural flaws. Dr. Aris was heavily overplaying his hand. I could see him sweating slightly under the bright lobby lights, his eyes darting nervously toward the officers to gauge if they were buying his performance. I knew that if I gave this corrupt fool just a little more rope, he would eagerly tie his own noose. I casually reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pressed the small tactile button on a high-grade micro-voice recorder I had purchased specifically for this very confrontation. With the device silently capturing every single syllable of our exchange, I finally looked Dr. Eris dead in the eyes. My voice was dangerously calm, crisp, and completely devoid of any neurological confusion. "Dr. Eris," I stated clearly, projecting my words perfectly, so the two police officers could hear every single detail of my response. "You are publicly claiming to be my primary care physician, yet you cannot seem to recall that I am severely allergic to the heavy sedatives you just threatened to inject me with. Furthermore, under strict state medical law, a clinical diagnosis of acute neurodegenerative psychosis requires a comprehensive battery of MRI scans and longitudinal cognitive testing. Could you please explain to these sworn officers the exact date and clinical location where you personally administered those extensive neurological exams on me?" Dr. Eris blinked rapidly, his confident medical facade cracking instantly under my razor-sharp legal cross-examination. He stammered, opening his mouth but failing to formulate a coherent lie. Before he could recover his footing or invent another excuse, I delivered the devastating financial blow. Perhaps I pressed stepping smoothly into his personal space while you are struggling to remember my fake medical history. You can accurately explain the $10,000 wire transfer that cleared into your private offshore account yesterday afternoon. The exact payment my son Cameron explicitly authorized to purchase the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation you filed with the county courthouse. The color completely drained from Dr. Eris's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. Absolute panic entirely overrode his logical filter as he desperately tried to defend himself against the sudden, terrifying accusation of federal financial bribery. "I never even examined you," he shouted frantically, stepping back and raising his trembling hands in a defensive panic. "Cameron just gave me the cash and told me exactly what to write on the evaluation forms. He said you were a lost cause anyway and nobody would care." The absolute silence that fell over the hospital lobby was incredibly deafening. The two police officers who had been standing just feet away, carefully observing the entire exchange, locked eyes with each other. The crooked doctor had just openly confessed to massive medical fraud and criminal conspiracy right in front of sworn law enforcement and the rolling cameras of the local press. The crisp morning air felt like a victorious celebration to Megan as she gripped the hand-stitched leather steering wheel of her drastically overpriced European sports car. She cruised smoothly down the bustling avenue of the city's most affluent commercial district, the engine purring softly. In her incredibly narrow mind, the extremely messy and chaotic events of the previous day were just temporary, frustrating roadblocks. She was absolutely certain that by now, Cameron and his highly paid lawyers were effectively handling the pathetic police situation and securing their permanent, irrevocable guardianship over his senile father. As far as she was concerned, Nelson was safely out of the picture, rotting away in that miserable state-funded facility where he truly belonged, never to bother them again. She pulled aggressively into her reserved VIP parking spot right in front of her high-end luxury fashion boutique. She adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and stepped out of the vehicle, fully expecting to see her impeccably dressed staff rushing around and preparing for a busy day of servicing wealthy clients. Instead, her confident, arrogant stride faltered instantly. Something was horribly wrong with her beautiful storefront. A massive neon orange legal notice was plastered dead center across the pristine, flawless glass of her boutique's front doors. Megan marched furiously up to the entrance, her sharp stiletto heels clicking aggressively against the concrete pavement like a rapid drumbeat. Heavy industrial steel chains and heavy-duty thick metal padlocks were wrapped tightly around the polished brass handles, completely barring her from entering her own business. She ripped her sunglasses off her face and stared in absolute pure horror at the bold black letters declaring an immediate emergency lease termination and full asset seizure. Her face turned a violent shade of red, a mixture of sheer embarrassment and uncontrollable rage. Without a single second of hesitation, she snatched her latest model smartphone from her designer purse and dialed the premium property management company that oversaw the entire luxury shopping district. When a polite receptionist nervously answered the line, Megan unleashed a torrential, relentless wave of pure, unadulterated venom. "You listen to me, you incompetent fools!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, drawing the shocked stares of passing pedestrians and nearby shop owners. "I demand to speak to the regional director this exact second. You have absolutely no legal right to lock me out of my own store. I have paid my exorbitant rent every single month, and I am a highly respected public figure in this city. If someone does not come down here and remove these ridiculous chains in the next 5 minutes, My elite legal team will personally bankrupt your entire management firm." She paced furiously back and forth across the sidewalk, hurling every vicious foul insult she could possibly think of. She aggressively threatened them with massive public defamation, multi-million-dollar lawsuits, and absolute corporate ruin, refusing to let the terrified receptionist speak a single word in defense. She was fully accustomed to bullying her way out of any inconvenience, using her fabricated status as an impenetrable shield. This glamorous luxury boutique was not just a simple retail clothing store to Megan. It was the physical ultimate manifestation of her arrogant superiority complex and her deeply flawed worldview. For years, she had happily utilized this exact location to shamelessly flaunt her supposed financial genius at every single family gathering. She would constantly make cruel, thinly veiled remarks about my scuffed work boots and calloused hands, proudly comparing her pristine high society showroom to my dirty blue-collar construction background. She loved to loudly boast that she had built an incredible fashion empire completely from scratch, looking down her perfectly contoured nose at the man she viewed as a pathetic, uneducated laborer who simply got lucky with a pension. What she never took the time to investigate, and what Cameron was far too ashamed and cowardly to ever admit to his own wife, was the actual secret source of her initial startup capital. When the local bank originally denied her massive business loan application due to her terrible credit score and lack of collateral, Cameron had come crying to my front door. I had quietly transferred a massive sum of my own hard-earned money into a hidden corporate trust to act as her silent financial guarantor. I literally built the foundation of her arrogant empire with the very hands she mocked, and she had spent the last 5 years using it to belittle me. The frantic receptionist on the phone finally managed to transfer the volatile call to the senior regional director of the property management firm. He answered the phone with a tone of absolute frigid professionalism, entirely unfazed by Megan's ongoing hysterical screaming and endless threats. "Mrs. Wright, I strongly suggest you lower your voice immediately," he stated, his calm, deep demeanor slicing right through her frantic, endless tirade. "Your commercial lease has been officially and permanently terminated effective as of midnight last night. This action is not a clerical mistake or a random oversight. It is a direct result of severe, unprecedented violations of your financial and ethical clauses." Megan stopped pacing, her breathing suddenly ragged and shallow. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly under her rapidly fading false bravado. "I have not violated anything. I am a model tenant." The director sighed audibly, a sound of pure administrative exhaustion. "Your primary corporate financial guarantor entirely withdrew their backing yesterday afternoon, leaving your account completely exposed and in immediate massive default. Furthermore, our organization maintains a strict ironclad morality clause for all tenants operating within this premium district. We received verified legal notification of your active involvement in fraudulent legal activities and elder abuse investigations. We simply do not do business with criminals, Mrs. Wright. Therefore, every single piece of seasonal inventory, designer clothing, and custom expensive furniture currently locked inside that building has been officially seized by the landlord to cover your outstanding massive debts and immediate penalty fees. You own absolutely nothing in there anymore. It is all completely gone." The brutal reality of his carefully chosen words slammed into her like a massive freight train. Her luxurious fortress had been systematically stripped away in a matter of seconds. Megan felt the cold, suffocating grip of total bankruptcy closing tightly around her throat. She was losing everything she had ever cared about. In a final, completely desperate attempt to assert her non-existent dominance, she shrieked into the receiver, refusing to accept defeat. "Who exactly authorized this illegal seizure? I demand to know the name of the billionaire who owns this commercial property right now, so I can personally destroy him in court." The line was quiet for a brief, agonizing moment. The senior director cleared his throat and spoke with absolute, devastating clarity. "The sole owner of this entire commercial property and the head of the investment board that just evicted you is Mr. Nelson Wright." The color instantly vanished from Megan's perfectly powdered face. Her manicured fingers went completely cold and numb. The expensive smartphone slipped from her weak grasp, plummeting toward the hard concrete sidewalk and shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. The heavy oak doors of the county family courthouse closed with a definitive thud, sealing the suffocating atmosphere inside the high-ceilinged room. Cameron and Megan were already seated at the polished plaintiff table, presenting a perfectly choreographed portrait of overwhelming exhaustion and deep emotional agony. They had meticulously dressed for their respective roles. Cameron wore a slightly wrinkled dark suit with a loosened tie to project the highly sympathetic image of a stressed, overworked son pushed to the absolute brink. Megan sat closely beside him, her face completely devoid of her usual heavy makeup, her eyes intentionally red and puffy as if she had been crying continuously for days over her missing father-in-law. They slumped in their sturdy wooden chairs, sighing heavily and exchanging weary glances for the direct benefit of the strict-looking judge presiding over the emergency guardianship hearing. They wanted everyone in that silent, imposing courtroom to believe they were bearing an unimaginable, crushing burden, desperately trying to save a senile old man who was currently wandering the dangerous, freezing city streets. They were entirely confident that their highly expensive legal team would easily finalize the permanent transfer of my estate within the hour. They truly thought they had already won the war. The slick defense attorney Cameron had hired using my stolen funds stood up and confidently approached the judge's bench. He was a fast-talking lawyer who specialized in manipulating family tragedies for quick, lucrative settlements. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with thick manufactured sympathy. "We are here today out of profound paternal love and absolute medical necessity. My client Cameron Wright is facing the most devastating decision a devoted son can ever make. His elderly father, Nelson Wright, has suffered a rapid, catastrophic decline in his cognitive faculties. He has become completely detached from reality, wandering the streets and abandoning his secure medical facility without a single trace." The lawyer dramatically gestured toward Cameron, who immediately buried his face in his hands, pulling out a pristine white handkerchief to dab at his perfectly dry eyes. The performance was nauseatingly flawless. The attorney continued pacing smoothly across the courtroom floor. "Nelson Wright is currently a massive danger to himself and the general public. He possesses significant financial assets that are incredibly vulnerable to predators and scam artists who actively prey on the mentally incompetent. My client is simply stepping up to bear this crushing, heavy responsibility. Cameron is formally requesting full permanent legal guardianship over his father's estate and medical decisions, not out of greed, but out of an absolute desperate need to protect his sick father from severe exploitation." Megan reached over and placed a comforting hand on Cameron's shoulder, rubbing his back while keeping her head bowed in fake sorrow. The judge, a stern, middle-aged man with graying hair, flipped through the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation provided by the corrupt Dr. Eris. He looked deeply moved by the tragic narrative unfolding before him, completely unaware that the weeping son and the supportive wife sitting just a few feet away were the actual predators meticulously plotting to strip a sane man of his entire life savings. They were using the hallowed halls of justice to execute the final devastating stage of their massive financial heist. I stood perfectly still in the quiet marble hallway just outside the heavy courtroom doors, listening to the muffled, sickening lies filtering through the thick wood. I slowly raised my hands and stared intently at my thick, calloused palms. These were not the weak, trembling hands of a helpless dementia patient. These were the rough, scarred hands of a master builder. Decades ago, I had used these exact hands to haul heavy steel beams and pour massive concrete foundations, working brutal double shifts in the scorching summer heat to pull my family out of generational poverty. I had meticulously drafted thousands of complex blueprints and negotiated ruthless commercial contracts to build a staggering, unseen real estate empire. Camille always told me that my hands were the true foundation of our family, capable of creating absolute safety and security. I had deliberately hidden my immense power behind frayed flannel shirts and scuffed work boots, hoping to teach my son the exact same ironclad work ethic. Instead, he saw my humility as weakness. He looked at the calluses on my fingers and saw an uneducated fool ripe for the picking. He was about to find out that the very same hands that built a towering empire could effortlessly tear down his pathetic house of cards. I gave a sharp, firm nod to the armed bailiff standing guard at the entrance. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a loud, echoing crash that instantly silenced the slick lawyer in mid-sentence. I stepped confidently into the brightly lit courtroom, leaving the frail old man persona permanently buried in the dirt of Shady Pines. I was no longer wearing the faded jeans and threadbare sweater they had dumped me in. I was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal gray $5,000 Italian suit, a crisp silk tie, and polished leather Oxfords that clicked with absolute unwavering authority against the hardwood floor. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders broad, and my gaze was fixed forward with the terrifying intensity of an apex predator entering his territory. Trailing closely behind me like a disciplined corporate army was Bradley Reed, the most feared commercial litigator in the state, accompanied by two sharp junior associates hauling massive thick leather briefcases packed with irrefutable legal weaponry. The sudden aggressive interruption caused a massive shockwave to ripple through the entire gallery. Every single head turned toward the aisle. The majestic dominating aura of a ruthless self-made tycoon completely evaporated the tragic narrative of a lost wandering senior citizen. I did not stumble. I did not look confused. I marched directly past the wooden divider separating the gallery from the legal teams, my presence commanding absolute silent respect from every single person in the room. Bradley Reed smoothly pulled out a heavy oak chair at the defense table, offering it to me with a crisp professional nod. I sat down methodically, unbuttoning my expensive suit jacket, and rested my scarred, powerful hands flat on the polished table. I was not there to defend myself against their pathetic accusations. I was there to completely annihilate them. Cameron sat completely frozen at the plaintiff table, his jaw literally dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. All the fake color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray as he stared at the impeccably dressed billionaire sitting directly across from him. Megan gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles turned stark white, her eyes wide with mounting, suffocating panic. The slick opposing lawyer stopped speaking, his mouth hanging slightly open as he desperately tried to reconcile his notes with the intimidating titan sitting before him. The judge, recovering from the sheer shock of the dramatic entrance, slammed his heavy wooden gavel down hard against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the dead silent courtroom. "Sir," the judge demanded, his voice booming with authority, "please state your full legal name for the official court record." I stood up slowly, buttoning my custom suit jacket, and looked directly up at the judge. "My name is Nelson Wright," I stated, my voice resonating with absolute clarity and unshakable authority. "I am fully legally competent, and I am here today to defend my own life and my own legacy against a highly fraudulent and deeply malicious petition." Before the judge could even process the sheer magnitude of my bold declaration, Cameron's slick defense attorney jumped to his feet, scrambling desperately to salvage his rapidly collapsing narrative. "Your Honor," he shouted, waving his hands frantically toward my defense table, "I strongly object to this highly orchestrated theatrical display. This is a complete and utter sham. My client explicitly warned us about this exact manipulative scenario. This man is suffering from severe cognitive decline and has clearly been hijacked by predatory individuals who dressed him up in expensive designer clothes to manipulate the emotions of this court. He is a highly vulnerable senior citizen being paraded around like a mindless puppet by greedy corporate opportunists trying to siphon his meager state pension. Do not let this flashy, expensive suit fool you for a single second. He does not even know where he is or what day it is. He is entirely compromised, and this display proves his severe vulnerability." Cameron immediately caught his lawyer's desperate cue and launched into another vile, highly theatrical performance. He stood up aggressively, gripping the edge of his wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white and forced thick, heavy tears into his eyes. "Dad, please," he pleaded, stretching a shaking, dramatic hand toward me across the wide center aisle. "Stop this complete nonsense. You are terribly sick. You are deeply confused and surrounded by bad people." He turned his pathetic fake gaze back to the judge, his voice dripping with thick, manufactured desperation. "Your Honor, please just look at him. My father is a simple, retired construction worker who has worn the same 3 faded flannel shirts for the last 10 years. He barely scraped by on a fixed state income his entire life. Now suddenly he is walking into a formal courtroom wearing a $5,000 custom Italian suit and flanked by a team of high-priced, ruthless corporate lawyers. This is the exact erratic, reckless behavior I specifically warned you about in my emergency medical petition. He is completely squandering his life savings in a severe manic episode. He does not understand the value of money anymore, and he is hemorrhaging cash. If you do not grant me immediate permanent guardianship today, he will be entirely bankrupt and living homeless on the freezing streets by the end of the month. Please sign the medical order right now before these vicious vultures completely drain his bank accounts and leave him to die alone." Megan chimed in aggressively, nodding vigorously along and dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed designer tissue. "We just want to protect him," she cried out, her voice shrill and demanding. "He is blowing his retirement money because his mind is completely gone. We are begging you to let us save him from himself." They were doubling down on their vicious lies, trying to twist my undeniable display of wealth and absolute power into fabricated medical proof of absolute insanity. I sat back down and folded my hands, resting them patiently on the polished mahogany table. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or show a single ounce of defensive panic. I maintained absolute icy composure while the storm raged around me. Throughout my 40-year career as a chief engineer and a highly successful stealth commercial developer, I had meticulously reviewed thousands of incredibly complex structural blueprints and negotiated massive corporate contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. When staggering fortunes are on the line, you quickly learn that the devil is always hiding in the smallest overlooked structural details. I had specifically trained my eyes to spot a millimeter of fatal misalignment in a heavy steel foundation or a single hidden toxic clause buried deep within a 50-page legal document. I simply applied that exact same rigorous analytical skill to my own son's pathetic and desperate testimony. His entire fabricated story was built on a foundation of loose, shifting sand. By loudly claiming I was a poor blue-collar worker who was suddenly spending massive amounts of money recklessly, he was legally cornering himself into explaining exactly where all that seemingly endless money was actually coming from. He was talking entirely too fast, digging his own grave deeper and deeper with every single dramatic word he uttered to the judge. I let him keep shoveling the dirt, perfectly content to sit back silently and watch him bury himself under the crushing, catastrophic weight of his own profound arrogance. Bradley Reed did not even bother to raise his powerful voice to interrupt their pathetic whining. He simply stood up, exuding the calm, lethal confidence of a great white shark circling a bleeding fish in open water. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents securely bound in heavy red folders. "Your Honor," Bradley said smoothly, his deep, authoritative tone slicing right through the frantic, noisy desperation of the plaintiff's table. "Opposing counsel claims my client is suffering from severe cognitive decline and gross financial recklessness. Let us examine the actual documentary evidence of who exactly is suffering from a severe lack of legal and moral judgment here today." He walked confidently to the judge's high bench and handed over the first heavy folder. "This is a certified sworn affidavit from the state's absolute leading forensic handwriting expert. It completely and undeniably invalidates the power of attorney document. Mr. Cameron Wright used just 48 hours ago to drain $40,000 from my client's personal checking account and secure a massive predatory commercial mortgage against my client's primary residence. The signature is a confirmed malicious forgery." A collective sharp gasp rippled violently through the packed courtroom gallery. Cameron's defense attorney visibly paled, sinking back into his chair. But Bradley was not even close to finish destroying them. He pulled a small digital audio player from his sleek vest pocket and placed it firmly on the wooden evidence table. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the plaintiff's entire medical petition relies completely on a psychiatric evaluation signed by a Dr. Aris. I formally submit into evidence this clear, unedited audio recording taken yesterday morning in the busy public lobby of the State Independent Medical Board." Bradley pressed play without waiting for a single objection. The panicked, terrified voice of the corrupt physician echoed loudly through the high-quality court speakers, clearly screaming that he had never even examined me, and that Cameron Wright had explicitly bribed him with $10,000 in cash to illegally falsify the entire medical report. The audio clip ended with a sharp, definitive click that sounded exactly like a heavy steel prison door slamming shut forever. Absolute dead silence descended upon the vast courtroom. The atmosphere became so thick, heavy, and suffocating that it felt like all the breathable oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room by a massive vacuum. The stern judge slowly lowered the forensic handwriting reports, his face hardening into an expression of absolute furious thunder. The thick veins in his neck visibly bulged against his white collar as he meticulously processed the staggering magnitude of the criminal fraud that had just been brazenly attempted in his own hallowed courtroom. He slowly lifted his piercing, unforgiving gaze from the damning documents and locked eyes directly with Cameron, who was now visibly shaking uncontrollably in his wooden chair. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel and pointed the carved handle aggressively at my terrified son. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, his voice booming with terrifying absolute authority that shook the very walls of the room. "Lock the heavy doors to this courtroom right now. Do not let a single person leave this room." The heavy locking mechanism of the double oak doors echoed with a terrifying finality. The insurmountable mountain of irrefutable evidence had completely crushed Cameron and his high-priced attorney. They sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the polished table as their entire malicious scheme disintegrated into dust right before their eyes. The courtroom was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence, but Megan did not possess the tactical intelligence to recognize when a war was irrevocably lost. Her arrogant pride and explosive temper violently overpowered any remaining shred of self-preservation. She forcefully pushed her heavy wooden chair back, causing it to screech loudly across the pristine floorboards, and stood abruptly. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her carefully maintained facade of the grieving, devoted daughter-in-law shattering into a million jagged pieces. She aggressively pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes blazing with an unhinged, frantic fury that shocked the entire courtroom. "You planned this, you miserable old fool!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the judges, furious demands for order, and the bailiffs stepping forward. "You are nothing but a selfish, stingy old man," Megan roared, her voice echoing shrilly off the high marble walls, filling the room with her toxic venom. "You sat there hoarding your secret money while my beautiful luxury boutique was completely destroyed. My entire business went bankrupt today because you were too cheap and too pathetic to help your own family." She was completely unraveling, broadcasting her toxic entitlement for the entire legal system to witness. "You owed us that money. You should have given it to us instead of forcing Cameron to take those loans. But no, you wanted to watch us struggle because you are just a bitter, resentful old laborer who hates anyone better than you." The bailiff stepped forward again to restrain her, but the judge held up a single hand, allowing her to dig her own grave even deeper into the bedrock. Megan completely lost all sense of boundaries, crossing a legal and moral line that could never be uncrossed. She glared at me with absolute vicious disgust, her tone dripping with raw, unfiltered racism. "You think putting on an expensive suit changes what you really are?" she sneered. Her face flushed a blotchy, violent red. "You are just a dirty, uneducated street worker. My family comes from a long line of refined, wealthy white heritage, and I had to significantly lower myself to marry into your pathetic blue-collar mess. I tolerated your cheap clothes and your smelly truck and your awful neighborhood for years, just waiting for my payout. You should have been grateful that a woman of my high-class status even allowed you to sit at my dining table. You belong in that state-funded dump cleaning the floors, not sitting in a courtroom trying to destroy your betters." She spewed her venomous bigotry without a single ounce of shame, revealing the dark, rotting core of her character to the absolute horror of every single person in the room. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, absorbing her vile, racist tirade without a single muscle twitching in my face. Looking at this vicious, hateful woman screaming her lungs out, I vividly remembered the exact conversation I had with my beloved Camille decades ago. When my commercial construction empire first started generating massive 8-figure profits, we made a conscious, deliberate decision to maintain our incredibly modest lifestyle. We knew that immense visible wealth acted like a bright beacon for dangerous, opportunistic parasites. We wanted Cameron to grow up valuing hard work, intellect, and genuine human connection over shallow material possessions. We specifically hid the money to ensure that whoever he eventually married would love him for his character and his heart, not for the immense size of his bank account. We wanted to passionately protect him from the shallow, ruthless gold diggers who would drain his soul and leave him empty. Tragically, my son had completely ignored every moral lesson we ever taught him. He had bypassed every decent, hardworking woman he ever met and willfully chosen to drink the exact deadly poison we had tried so desperately to shield him from. He voluntarily married a woman whose entire existence was built on shallow superiority and toxic, unyielding greed. When Megan finally ran out of breath, standing there panting and glaring at me with pure hatred, I did not yell back. I did not match her frantic, chaotic energy or stoop to her repulsive level of bigotry. I simply adjusted my silk tie and spoke with a low, dangerously calm voice that commanded absolute silence across the vast room. "Bradley," I instructed smoothly without taking my eyes off the furious woman across the aisle. "Please provide Her Honor with the certified corporate ownership portfolios and the commercial loan guarantee files right now." Bradley swiftly pulled 2 thick embossed folders from his heavy briefcase and handed them directly to the bailiff, who promptly passed them up to the judge's high bench. I leaned forward, resting my powerful forearms on the polished table. Megan, I stated, my voice resonating with crushing, undeniable authority. "Your profound ignorance is truly matched only by your staggering arrogance. You just stood in a federal court of law and blamed me for the sudden bankruptcy of your luxury boutique. What you completely failed to realize while you were busy mocking my skin color and my honest construction background is the actual identity of your commercial landlord." The judge opened the file, her eyes widening considerably as she read the certified corporate deeds and binding lease agreements. "The prime commercial real estate where you built your precious high-class fashion store is owned entirely by an anonymous investment group that I personally created and wholly control," I declared, watching the color begin to rapidly drain from her flushed, angry face. "You have been paying exorbitant monthly rent directly to the dirty, uneducated street worker for the last 5 years. Furthermore," I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single word landed like a physical blow, "that massive $200,000 business loan you and Cameron took out to fund your lavish lifestyle was initially denied by every major bank in this state due to your terrible credit. It was only approved because my private $8 million trust fund secretly served as the absolute financial guarantor. When I froze my assets this morning, I pulled the floor right out from under you." Megan physically staggered backward as if I had struck her directly in the chest with a heavy steel beam. Her expensive designer heels wobbled unsteadily beneath her, and she was forcefully compelled to grip the edge of the plaintiff table just to keep her trembling, weak legs from giving out completely. The absolute horrifying reality of her inescapable situation crashed down upon her like a collapsing concrete wall. She had just spent the last 5 minutes viciously insulting, racially degrading, and aggressively demanding the permanent institutionalization of the one single human being on the entire planet who held absolute total control over her entire financial existence. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth opening and closing silently, as the devastating finality of her monumental, catastrophic mistake finally set in. The crushing, brutal reality of her inescapable situation slammed into Megan with the force of a speeding freight train. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled violently as she gripped the edge of the plaintiff table for dear life. She was not just losing her precious, overpriced luxury boutique. She was suddenly staring down the barrel of a colossal, insurmountable mountain of debt that she had absolutely no legal or financial means to repay. The $200,000 commercial loan previously shielded by my secret trust fund was now a massive ticking time bomb strapped directly to her chest. Without my corporate backing, her creditors would viciously descend upon her, stripping away her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her fabricated high society status in a matter of days. Her arrogant superiority complex shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces, replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a woman about to be completely ruined. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her a sickening shade of pale gray as the absolute certainty of her impending bankruptcy finally took hold. Absolute desperation has a funny way of stripping away even the strongest illusions of loyalty. Driven entirely by her innate toxic selfishness, Megan instantly shifted her survival instincts into overdrive. She spun around, her eyes wide and wild, and launched a vicious, unhinged verbal assault directly at the man sitting right beside her. "This is all your fault, Cameron!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceiling of the courtroom. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger right into her husband's terrified face, violently throwing him under the bus to save her own skin. "I never wanted any part of this disgusting plan. He forced me to go along with it. He is the one who wanted to lock you away in that filthy nursing home so he could steal the house." The rapid betrayal was spectacularly pathetic. Megan began frantically pleading with the stern judge, her voice dripping with fake, desperate victimhood. "Your Honor, I am just an innocent wife who trusted a manipulative liar. He told me his father was genuinely sick. He told me the cash from the house sale was the only way to save my business. He made all the calls, he forged the documents, he orchestrated this entire nightmare." Cameron shrank back in his heavy wooden chair, completely paralyzed by the sudden, vicious attack from his own partner in crime. The so-called United Front they had meticulously rehearsed and paraded into the courtroom just an hour ago completely disintegrated into a chaotic, messy bloodbath. Megan was desperately trying to rewrite history, portraying herself as a helpless pawn rather than the greedy, demanding mastermind who had literally thrown my duffel bag into the dirt and mocked my working-class roots just days prior. She stood there shaking, completely willing to testify against the man she married just to avoid facing the crushing weight of federal fraud charges. It was a stunning display of absolute cowardice. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching this pathetic, spectacular implosion with absolute icy detachment. My brilliant Camille and I had built a 40-year marriage on a rock-solid foundation of mutual respect, grueling hard work, and unwavering, unconditional loyalty. We had survived lean winters, exhausting double shifts, and immense personal sacrifices by holding tightly to each other. Looking at my son and his vicious wife tearing each other apart like rabid dogs fighting over a scrap of meat, the tragic reality of their shallow existence was blindingly clear. Their entire marriage had never been built on love or partnership. It was a flimsy transactional arrangement constructed entirely on a foundation of deceit, toxic ambition, and heavily maxed-out credit cards. The very second the artificial flow of my hidden wealth was aggressively cut off, the weak adhesive holding their miserable relationship together dissolved completely. Without the flashy cars, the luxury vacations, and the stolen cash to prop up their arrogant delusions, there was absolutely nothing left between them but raw, selfish desperation. They were two empty, greedy parasites who fundamentally despised each other, and I was finally forcing them to face the ugly, destitute reality they had built for themselves. They had no true bond, no moral compass, and absolutely no loyalty when the money vanished. Cameron was a proven coward, but a cornered, terrified coward will eventually strike back when stripped of all his options. His initial shock rapidly mutated into explosive defensive fury. He leaped to his feet, knocking his heavy oak chair backward with a loud crash, and leaned aggressively toward his screaming wife. "Do not you dare play the innocent victim here, Megan," he roared, his voice cracking with intense, humiliating panic. "You are the one who practically begged me to forge those bank documents. You are severely addicted to shopping and bleeding us dry." Cameron turned wildly toward the judge and the packed gallery, completely airing out their toxic, filthy laundry for the entire legal system to witness. "She has 6 secret credit cards completely maxed out on designer garbage," he shouted, his face flushed a violent, blotchy red. "I had to drain my father's accounts just to stop your loan sharks from repossessing our cars, and do not even try to deny your constant cheating. I know all about the personal trainer you have been secretly seeing in the city while I was busy trying to save your failing boutique." The devastating public exposure of her rampant infidelity and massive hidden debts hit Megan like a physical shockwave. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Without a single second of hesitation, Megan drew her hand back and delivered a vicious, resounding slap directly across Cameron's face. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm hitting his cheek echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. Cameron stumbled backward, clutching his bright red face in absolute shock. The entire courtroom erupted into sheer, unmanageable chaos. The gallery gasped loudly, reporters frantically scribbled on their notepads, and the 2 armed bailiffs immediately rushed forward to physically pull the screaming, thrashing couple apart before the physical violence escalated any further. They were brawling like common criminals in a federal building, entirely destroying whatever tiny shred of credibility they had left. The judge hammered his heavy wooden gavel relentlessly against the sounding block, shouting furiously for absolute order in his courtroom, but the chaotic, ugly screaming match between husband and wife continued to rage. I had seen enough of this pathetic, miserable circus. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, instantly commanding the attention of the room, and firmly buttoned my custom suit jacket. "Your Honor," I stated, my deep, steady voice effortlessly slicing through the chaotic noise and bringing the room to an immediate dead halt. "I respectfully request that we bring a permanent end to this embarrassing, insulting farce." I turned to my attorney, Bradley Reed, who was already holding a thick-sealed legal document ready for submission. "I am officially filing a formal request for the immediate criminal prosecution of Cameron Wright for grand larceny, document forgery, and severe elder financial abuse. I will not tolerate this any longer. Let the real justice begin." The sharp, explosive crack of the heavy wooden gavel slammed relentlessly against the sounding block, violently cutting through the chaotic screaming match between Cameron and Megan. "Order in my courtroom," The judge roared, his voice booming with an undeniable, terrifying authority that instantly froze the warring couple in their tracks. Silence descended upon the room so abruptly it felt as though all the breathable air had been aggressively sucked out of the space. The judge leaned far over his elevated mahogany bench, his face a tight mask of absolute unfiltered indignation. He glared down at the two plaintiffs with eyes burning with righteous fury, utterly disgusted by the spectacular display of blatant fraud and moral bankruptcy they had just paraded before the legal system. They had dared to walk into a federal building and attempt to legally sanction the kidnapping and financial ruin of a completely sane, honorable man. The sheer audacity of their malicious scheme hung heavy and toxic in the stifling air. The judge adjusted his glasses, his jaw tightly clenched as he looked from the undeniable stack of forensic evidence resting on his desk to the pathetic trembling figures of my son and his vicious wife waiting for the hammer to drop. "I have presided over this family court for more than 2 decades. The judge began, his deep voice laced with absolute contempt, and I have rarely witnessed such a cold-blooded, calculated attempt to exploit a senior citizen for selfish financial gain. This entire emergency guardianship petition is an absolute insult to the judicial system and a gross manipulation of the laws designed to protect the vulnerable. Based on the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence presented today by the defense, including the certified forensic handwriting analysis and the recorded confession of egregious medical bribery, I am hereby dismissing this petition entirely with extreme prejudice. Nelson Wright is a fully competent, independent citizen, and he retains absolute permanent control over his life and his assets." The loud collective sigh of relief from the gallery was immediately cut short as the judge shifted his piercing gaze directly onto my son. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy level. "The court absolutely cannot ignore the severe criminal acts committed to facilitate this highly fraudulent petition. Cameron Wright, you have actively submitted forged legal documents, engaged in grand larceny, and willfully attempted to defraud your own father of his lifelong estate. I am formally holding you in direct contempt of court, and I am ordering your immediate arrest pending formal criminal charges for elder financial abuse and wire fraud." Cameron physically recoiled backward as if he had been struck directly in the chest by lightning. He looked wildly around the room, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no words managed to come out. The arrogant high society persona he had worn like a cheap Halloween costume completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, pathetic coward who finally realized there was no escape from the devastating consequences of his own toxic greed. He had dug a massive grave for me, but he was the one being violently pushed inside. 2 heavily armed court bailiffs immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom, moving with swift, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Cameron by his trembling shoulders and forcefully spun him around. I watched in absolute silence as my son had his arms violently wrenched behind his back. The cold, sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed like a final definitive judgment across the silent room. For a fleeting, agonizing fraction of a second, a sharp wave of profound paternal grief washed over my chest. Looking at his terrified, sweating face, I suddenly remembered the bright, sunny afternoon in our small backyard over 30 years ago when I held those exact same hands. I remembered coaxing a tiny, stumbling toddler to take his very first unsteady steps toward me on the patchy grass, cheering him on with unbridled pride. I had built an entire commercial empire with the singular burning hope of giving that little boy a life completely free of the grueling poverty and systemic barriers I had personally endured. But the ghost of that innocent child was long dead, completely consumed by the toxic, greedy man standing before me in chains. The fleeting pain in my heart was instantly extinguished, permanently replaced by a hardened, unbreakable steel resolve. He had made his choice, and now he had to pay the price. As the bailiffs began to forcefully march him toward the heavy side doors leading to the holding cells, the absolute reality of his impending incarceration finally shattered Cameron's remaining sanity. He dug the heels of his expensive leather shoes into the polished hardwood floor, violently resisting the guards, and turned his tear-streaked face toward me. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice cracking in an ugly, desperate pitch that filled the vast courtroom. "I am so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Please, just tell them to let me go. Tell your lawyer to drop the charges. I will pay you back every single penny, I swear to God. Just do not let them put me in a cage." He was sobbing uncontrollably, snot and tears running down his face. completely abandoning any shred of dignity he had left. He was desperately trying to cash in on a paternal bond he had completely bankrupted. He was begging the very same man he had coldly dumped at the rusted gates of Shady Pines just days prior. I stood perfectly still, my custom suit immaculate, my posture completely unbothered. I looked him dead in the eyes with an expression of absolute calm detachment. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a single syllable of comfort or anger. The time for fatherly advice and second chances had officially expired the exact moment he locked me in a damp room with a fake hospital gown. I simply stared at him, a cold, silent monument to the absolute finality of his destruction. My utter silence was far more devastating than any furious shouting could ever be. It communicated the ultimate terrifying truth. He was completely and permanently cut off from my protection. The bailiffs yanked him forward, ignoring his pathetic cries, and dragged him kicking and screaming through the heavy wooden doors. With her husband being violently dragged away to a prison cell, Megan saw her rapidly shrinking window of opportunity. She slowly backed away from the plaintiff table, grabbing her designer purse, and attempting to quietly slip toward the main exit at the back of the gallery. She thought she could simply slink away into the shadows and completely abandon the burning wreckage of her marriage, leaving Cameron to take the fall alone. But just as her manicured hand reached for the heavy brass door handle, the doors swung open aggressively from the outside. 3 stern individuals wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back stepped directly into her path. They were federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Megan Wright, a tall, unsmiling agent, stated firmly, flashing a gold badge, "We have a federal warrant for your immediate detention regarding massive tax evasion and commercial wire fraud. You are not going anywhere." Several weeks after that explosive morning in the federal courthouse, the massive storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape of absolute unsalvageable ruin for those who had plotted my demise. The deafening echo of the judge's gavel and the sharp snap of handcuffs had faded, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of severe legal consequences. The towering house of cards Cameron and Megan had built on a foundation of lies and stolen money had spectacularly collapsed, burying them entirely under its heavy debris. Their names, which they had once tried to elevate in high society circles, were now permanently splashed across local tabloids and legal ledgers as cautionary tales of greed and elder abuse. I sat quietly in the expansive sunroom of my newly purchased lakeside estate, sipping a warm cup of black coffee and watching the morning mist roll gently across the water. The suffocating anxiety that had choked me in that dark, damp room at Shady Pines was completely gone. In its place was a profound, unshakable tranquility. I had survived their vicious assassination attempt on my character and my freedom. The predators had been thoroughly declawed and caged, and I was finally breathing crisp, clean air entirely on my own terms. Megan, true to her inherently selfish and opportunistic nature, did not waste a single second attempting to salvage the smoldering wreckage of her marriage. With Cameron securely locked away in a county detention cell awaiting his formal criminal trial, she immediately and ruthlessly filed for divorce. She desperately hoped that legally severing her ties to my son would somehow magically shield her from the incoming tsunami of federal tax evasion charges and commercial fraud penalties. It was a pathetic, desperate maneuver that completely failed to impress the ruthless auditors at the Internal Revenue Service or the federal prosecutors building a massive case against her. Her prized luxury boutique was entirely liquidated to satisfy her towering corporate debts. The shiny European sports car she loved to parade around town was quickly repossessed right off the street by aggressive bank agents. To afford even the cheapest cut-rate defense attorney, she was brutally forced to sell off her entire collection of designer handbags, custom jewelry, and high-end shoes for pennies on the dollar to local pawn shops. The glamorous high society lifestyle she had weaponized to belittle me completely evaporated into thin air. She was violently evicted from their sprawling high-rise luxury apartment and forced to relocate to a cramped, dingy motel room on the run-down industrial side of the city. My private investigator sent me a photograph of her dragging a cheap plastic trash bag full of her remaining clothes up the rusted exterior stairs of the motel, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow with pure exhaustion. She was now staring down the barrel of severe bankruptcy penalties and the very real threat of a lengthy federal prison sentence. She had traded a comfortable, stable life for absolute ruin simply because her toxic greed demanded more than she could ever honestly earn. The sheer irony of her sleeping in a room far worse than the one she had tried to condemn me to at Shady Pines was a testament to poetic justice. Meanwhile, the legal team, led by Bradley Reed, had swiftly and successfully reversed the fraudulent mortgage Cameron had illegally placed on my old suburban home. The property was fully restored to my name without a single remaining lien. I hired a premium contracting crew to completely renovate the entire structure from the foundation to the roof, fixing the squeaky floorboards and applying a fresh coat of bright paint. However, when the massive renovation was finally complete, I made the conscious, deliberate decision not to move back in. That modest house held 4 decades of beautiful memories with my beloved Camille, but it had also been deeply contaminated by the vicious betrayal of our only son. The walls that once echoed with his childhood laughter now only reminded me of his cruel, sneering voice plotting my institutionalization. I instructed the real estate agency to put the pristine property on the open market and sell it to the highest bidder. I needed to completely sever the heavy anchor of my painful past to truly move forward. Walking through those empty, freshly painted rooms one last time, I looked up at the ceiling and spoke silently to Camille. I knew with absolute certainty that looking down from heaven, she would entirely understand and support my firm decision to let go. We had done our best, but the boy we raised was gone. With my assets fully secured and my enemies completely neutralized, I turned my attention to the one person who had shown me a flicker of humanity in my darkest hour. I arranged a quiet private meeting at a highly respected downtown coffee shop with Tanya, the exhausted African-American nurse from Shady Pines. When she walked through the glass doors looking tired and deeply apprehensive in her faded medical scrubs, she still had my vintage gold Rolex securely tucked in her jacket pocket. She slid into the booth across from me, gently placing the heavy timepiece onto the table between us. "I did not pawn it, Mr. Wright," she said quietly, her voice laced with nervous hesitation. "I kept it safe just like you asked, but I cannot accept something this valuable just for making a single phone call." I smiled warmly, sliding the priceless watch back into my own pocket. "You are absolutely right, Tanya," I replied smoothly, my tone filled with genuine respect. "A watch is a terrible foundation for a bright future." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, certified cashier's check drawn directly from my private trust fund. I slid it across the table toward her. Tanya looked down at the staggering amount printed clearly on the heavy paper, and her breath caught sharply in her throat. Her eyes widened in sheer disbelief as she stared at a sum large enough to completely alter the trajectory of her entire life. "That is exactly enough money to fully cover the tuition for an advanced registered nursing degree at the top medical university in the state," I explained calmly, watching tears of pure shock well up in her eyes. "It also covers your living expenses for the next 3 years. You are far too smart and far too compassionate to waste your life working in a corrupt hellhole like Shady Pines. Hand in your resignation today, Tanya, and go build the life you actually deserve." She covered her mouth with trembling hands, silently weeping tears of absolute profound gratitude. Later that evening, I stood on the expansive wooden deck of my new lakeside property, watching the fiery orange sun slowly dip below the calm horizon. The cool evening breeze carried the fresh scent of pine trees and open water, a stark, beautiful contrast to the heavy, suffocating air of my recent captivity. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling entirely at peace with the new world I had built from the ashes of betrayal. The absolute silence of the tranquil evening was suddenly pierced by the sharp, jarring ringtone of my secure smartphone resting on the patio table. I walked over and picked up the device, staring intently at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed an automated message. "You have an incoming collect call from an inmate at the State County Correctional Facility." It was Cameron. I pressed the button to accept the charges, the automated voice fading into a sharp metallic click. "Dad, please do not hang up." Cameron's voice trembled through the tiny speaker, sounding completely shattered and echoing weakly against the cold concrete walls of the county detention center. It was a pathetic, desperate sound, entirely stripped of the arrogant swagger he had paraded through the federal courtroom just weeks prior. The man who had confidently strutted around in expensive tailored suits was now reduced to a weeping, frightened shell locked in a tiny holding cell. "Dad, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have to pay my bail right now. The conditions in here are an absolute waking nightmare, and I cannot survive another night locked in this freezing cage surrounded by actual criminals." The judge set the bond, but Megan took whatever hidden cash we had left and my high-priced lawyers completely abandoned me the exact second the retainers ran out. I just need you to wire the funds so I can get out and properly prepare for the upcoming criminal trial. Please, Dad, you are the only person on earth who can save me now. His panicked, frantic pleas rushed through the phone, a pathetic, transparent attempt to reverse the devastating permanent consequences of his own monumental greed. I stood perfectly still, listening to the exact same man who had forcefully locked me in a miserable psychiatric ward, now crying hysterically about being locked in a cage himself. When his initial frantic begging failed to elicit a single response from me, Cameron instantly switched his tactics, pivoting smoothly to aggressive emotional manipulation. He lowered his voice, injecting it with a manufactured, sickening sweetness specifically designed to break a grieving father's heart. "Dad, I know I messed up terribly." He sobbed, pulling out every psychological trick he had learned over the years to escape accountability. I was completely blinded by the massive, overwhelming debts and Megan's toxic, ruthless ambition. She manipulated my intense fear of bankruptcy and forced me into making those horrible, catastrophic choices regarding your estate. But I have had so much time to think sitting alone in this dark cell. I remember when I was a little boy and you spent all weekend building that wooden treehouse for me in the backyard. You always protected me from the world. You always told me that family sticks together no matter what happens. Mom would want us to fix this massive misunderstanding. She would want you to forgive me and give me one last chance to be the good, honorable son you and she raised. He was actively weaponizing the sacred, beautiful memory of my late wife, twisting the pure, unconditional love Camille had for him into a cheap transactional bargaining chip to buy his own freedom. "I will completely change my entire life, I swear to God," he continued, his voice rising in a desperate, panicked pitch. "I will immediately check into a rehabilitation clinic for my severe gambling problems. I will work for you at your commercial company, starting from the absolute bottom, sweeping the floors if I have to. Just post the bail money and let me come home where I belong. I have learned my harsh lesson, Dad. I promise I will never, ever take you or your incredible generosity for granted again. Just open the door for me one last time." He was reciting a perfectly rehearsed script of fake redemption, desperately throwing a handful of nostalgic childhood memories against a massive brick wall, hoping something would magically stick. I stood on the expansive, polished cedar balcony of my newly purchased, sprawling lakefront villa, letting the cool, crisp evening breeze wash over my face. The majestic, luxurious property was a stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile, hostile environment he had maliciously tried to condemn me to. Staring out at the calm, dark water shimmering brightly under the full moonlight, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute clarity. For decades, I had poured my entire heart, soul, and massive financial resources into nurturing his growth and protecting his future. I had constantly shielded him from the harsh, brutal realities of the world, foolishly hoping my unconditional love and financial safety nets would be enough to mold him into an honorable, successful man. But looking back, I realized that Camille had been absolutely right all those years ago. Blind love cannot cure a deeply rooted toxic infection. When a structural foundation is fundamentally compromised by rot, pouring more expensive concrete on top only guarantees a much more catastrophic eventual collapse. Cameron had willingly chosen to plant and nurture the vile seeds of greed, betrayal, and absolute cowardice. He had not made a simple, spontaneous mistake under pressure. He had meticulously executed a calculated, prolonged assassination attempt on my freedom, my assets, and my personal dignity. The most expensive and profound moral lessons in life cannot be continuously subsidized by a wealthy, forgiving father. They must be paid for in full using the offender's own personal freedom. I let his pathetic, desperate sobbing echo through the phone for a few more agonizing seconds, allowing the absolute dead silence on my end to crush whatever tiny shred of false hope he was desperately clinging to. When I finally spoke, my voice was incredibly deep, resonant, and completely devoid of any remaining paternal warmth. It was the uncompromising voice of a seasoned judge delivering a final, irrevocable sentence. "Cameron," I stated firmly, my words cutting sharply through the cool night air like a heavy steel blade. "You do not get to invoke your mother's sacred memory to magically escape the federal prison you painstakingly built with your own two hands. You threw me out like absolute garbage in the freezing rain to steal my life savings, and now you expect me to simply purchase your freedom with the exact same money you tried to embezzle. You have completely misunderstood the fundamental value of our relationship and the severity of your own actions. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the last heavy anchor of my painful past completely detach from my soul forever. True love and loyalty cannot ever be bought with betrayal. I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy level that offered absolutely zero room for negotiation. And absolute freedom is certainly not reserved for a man who is entirely willing to sell his own family to the highest bidder just to fund a shallow, miserable lifestyle. You wanted to live a life of ruthless, high-stakes consequences. Now you get to sit in that cell and fully experience every single one of them.
Dad, wait, no, please!
Cameron shrieked, absolute raw terror finally ripping through his throat as the devastating permanent reality of my words slammed into him. I did not listen to another single syllable of his panicked screaming. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, permanently severing the connection and cutting off his frantic cries. Without a single moment of hesitation, I immediately contacted my cellular service provider and issued a strict administrative directive to permanently block any future incoming calls from the county correctional facility. He was officially and permanently erased from my life. The long, grueling war was officially over, and I had emerged completely victorious. The very next morning, I finalized the complex legal paperwork with Bradley Reed to establish a massive multi-million-dollar endowment fund in my late wife's honor. The Camille Wright Foundation was officially created to provide aggressive free legal representation and strict financial protection for vulnerable elderly African American citizens facing malicious financial abuse from predatory family members. I would actively use my immense wealth and structural expertise to ensure no one else would ever have to endure the terrifying, isolating nightmare I had successfully defeated. I walked back out onto my serene balcony holding a warm cup of herbal tea. I took a slow, comforting sip and smiled warmly at the perfectly calm, silent lake spreading out beautifully before me. The heavy, toxic burdens of my past were entirely gone, washed away by the clear waters of ultimate justice. At 69 years old, my true, completely authentic life was finally just beginning. As I sit here looking out over the tranquil waters of my new lakefront home bathed in the soft golden light of the morning sun, I find myself reflecting on the greatest and most painful lesson this entire ordeal has taught me. For my entire life, I was conditioned by society, by tradition, and by my own hopeful heart to believe that blood is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are taught from the absolute moment we become parents that our children are our ultimate legacy. We are relentlessly instructed that we must sacrifice our own comfort, our own dreams, and sometimes our own basic dignity to ensure their survival and their success. We are told that family is an impenetrable sanctuary against the harshness of the outside world. But the brutal, undeniable truth I had to learn at 69 years old is that blood is nothing more than simple biology. It is merely a genetic coincidence. True family, the kind that stands firmly by your side in your darkest, most terrifying hours, is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and genuine, unselfish empathy. Cameron shared my physical DNA, but he completely lacked my soul and my moral compass. He looked at the father who had wiped his tears, financed his education, and built his safety nets, and he saw absolutely nothing but a convenient expiration date and a massive dollar sign. Learning to sever that biological tie was the most agonizing psychological surgery of my life, but it was also the absolute key to my survival. If you are holding on to a toxic, abusive relationship simply because you share a last name or a family tree, you are not preserving a family. You are voluntarily financing your own emotional and financial destruction. The second profound lesson revolves around the true nature of wealth and the illusions we build around it. For decades, Camille and I deliberately chose to hide our massive financial success behind frayed flannel shirts, scuffed work boots, and a modest suburban home. We did this because we inherently understood a fundamental, unforgiving law of human nature. Money does not change people. It never has, and it never will. Money simply acts as a powerful magnifying glass, instantly revealing the exact character that was already hiding quietly beneath the surface. When Cameron and Megan firmly believed I was just a poor, struggling, retired construction worker, their innate arrogance, their cruel entitlement, and their complete lack of basic human decency were proudly on full public display. They treated me like discarded garbage because they believed I possessed absolutely no financial leverage to fight back against their cruelty. But when that carefully crafted illusion was spectacularly shattered in the federal courtroom and they were suddenly confronted by a man who possessed the ultimate financial power to crush their pathetic, shallow empires, their sudden, tearful apologies were not born out of love or genuine regret. They were born entirely out of pure, unadulterated panic. They did not regret locking me in that miserable, damp nursing home room. They only regretted that they had locked the wrong man inside. I learned the hard way that true wealth is not measured by the number of zeros in a hidden offshore trust fund or the square footage of a luxury high society boutique. True wealth is the absolute pristine peace of mind I feel right now, knowing that the people surrounding my life today cannot be bought and that the vicious predators have been permanently exiled from my kingdom. Perhaps the most difficult realization I had to face was acknowledging my own unintentional role in Cameron's catastrophic downfall. As a father who had hauled heavy concrete, poured steel foundations, and worked grueling double shifts to escape the grinding, brutal jaws of poverty, my deepest, most instinctual desire was to cushion my son from the harsh realities of the world. I wanted to give him the smooth, easy, comfortable path I never had the privilege of walking. But in my desperate, loving attempt to protect him, I inadvertently committed the ultimate parental sin. I deeply confused helping with enabling. By constantly providing secret financial safety nets, by quietly backing his massive commercial loans and subsidizing his lavish, arrogant lifestyle, I completely robbed him of the vital opportunity to develop genuine character, fierce resilience, and a sturdy moral compass. Any master engineer knows that if you build a structure on soft, shifting sand, instead of forcing it to anchor into solid bedrock, a total collapse is absolutely inevitable. When you constantly cushion a person's every fall, they never actually learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. They simply learn to expect that the ground will always be soft and accommodating. My unconditional love had tragically mutated into a toxic blind subsidy for his monstrous greed. The hardest, most unnatural thing a parent can ever do is to completely remove that safety net and let their adult child plummet into the devastating, severe consequences of their own reckless actions. Listening to Cameron sob frantically through the phone from his cold county jail cell broke my heart into a million pieces. But paying his bail would have permanently destroyed his last remaining chance at true redemption. Sometimes the most profound act of pure love you can offer a toxic, dangerous person is the absolute uncompromising enforcement of a hard boundary. You cannot save a drowning man who is actively trying to pull you under the dark water with him. You have to let go of his hand, swim strongly to the shore, and let him figure out how to survive the terrible storm he intentionally created. Society constantly whispers a very dangerous, pervasive lie to the elderly. It tells us that as our hair turns gray and our physical steps naturally slow down, we must quietly, gracefully retreat into the unseen shadows. We are heavily expected to become docile, passive observers in our own lives, willingly handing over the reins of our independence and our assets to the younger generation. We are taught to be deeply grateful for whatever meager scraps of attention and rushed care our children decide to throw our way. But age is absolutely not a mandate for obsolescence, and physical vulnerability is certainly not an open invitation for exploitation. The exact moment I stepped out of that terrifying dark room at Shady Pines into the freezing rain, I made a conscious, unbreakable vow to completely reject the pathetic victim narrative my son had cruelly scripted for me. I refused to let my age dictate my strength or my value. We, the older generation, possess decades of hard-earned wisdom, tactical life experience, and an absolute non-negotiable right to demand basic human dignity. We have survived global wars, severe economic depressions, and profound personal heartbreaks. We are not disposable burdens waiting to be warehoused. Reclaiming my overwhelming power in that federal courtroom was not just a personal vindication over a greedy son and a racist daughter-in-law. It was a loud, defiant public declaration that I am still the undisputed master of my own fate, the sole architect of my own legacy, and the absolute ruler of my own life. It is never too late to stand up to fight back with everything you have and to completely rewrite the final defining chapters of your own story. That is exactly why the Camille Wright Foundation now exists and operates with ruthless efficiency today. I am utilizing every single ounce of my immense wealth and my vast structural expertise to actively hunt down the cowards who maliciously prey on vulnerable seniors. We are providing aggressive elite legal representation to the elderly men and women who are currently trapped in the exact same terrifying, isolating nightmare I successfully escaped. We are actively dragging corrupt doctors, fraudulent, manipulative lawyers, and greedy, abusive family members out of the dark shadows and forcing them to face the blinding, unforgiving light of federal justice. My personal family tragedy was not the end of my life. It was the brutal, incredibly necessary catalyst that pushed me directly toward my ultimate profound purpose. As I sit here today feeling the warm, healing sun on my face and listening to the quiet, peaceful rhythm of the lake water, I am profoundly grateful for the intense fire I had to walk through. It burned away the comfortable illusions, incinerated the toxic family ties, and left behind a man forged of unbreakable steel. I am Nelson Wright, a proud father, a master builder, and a survivor who flatly refused to be buried alive. Did you find value in my story and the hard lessons I had to learn about family wealth and setting unbreakable boundaries? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please hit the like and subscribe buttons so I can continue sharing powerful stories of survival and absolute justice with you all.